Every person currently on the FBI's most wanted list. Chances are you've heard about the FBI's most wanted list at some point in your life. It's also likely that you don't know much about it besides the fact that it's a list of criminals. Well, I was in the same boat, so I did some research. And today I'm going to explain a brief history about the FBI's most wanted list and then take a deep dive into every single person who's on the list and why they're there. Spoiler alert, these are some bad people. The most wanted list was actually born in 1949 when the director of the FBI was at dinner with the chief and editor of the International News Service as they were discussing ways to promote and capture the FBI's toughest guys. The FBI wanted to use the newspaper to spread awareness to civilians to get more tips to help arm law enforcement with information. Shortly after this meeting, the list was published, and that very same day, one of the members that was on the initial list was caught. And from that point on, the FBI's most wanted list has been a staple when it comes to high-level justice. To be eligible to even be put on the FBI's most wanted list, you have to do some terrible things. And in most cases, you have to have a long history or a string of multiple things under your belt. Some examples of which we're gonna get into today. Oh, and the only ways to be removed from this list are being captured or dying. So take your pick. Alejandro Castillo. It's crazy that the first entry on this list is the youngest entry by far. Alejandro was only born in 1998 on November 26th, making him only 26 years old at the time of this recording. He was born in Arizona and is currently 5'6" and weighs anywhere from 180 to 190 pounds. He is male and Hispanic, and what landed him on this list may shock you. When Alejandro was only 17 years old, he was working at a Shomar's restaurant in Charlotte, North Carolina. He worked at this restaurant with his girlfriend. But not only his girlfriend, his ex-girlfriend also worked there as well. Alejandro's ex-girlfriend, Sandy, lent him some money, but unfortunately, she went missing before he could pay her back. But even stranger is the day after that Sandy, his ex-girlfriend, went missing, both Alejandro and his current girlfriend went missing as well. But although they all went missing, Alejandro and his girlfriend were no victims. They simply were on the run. What happened was the night before his ex-girlfriend Sandy went missing, Alejandro and Sandy had plans of meeting up so Alejandro could repay his debt, although that was never his intention. When the two met up, Alejandro and his girlfriend forced Sandy to get in the vehicle, and it was at that point when Alejandro's girlfriend held a gun to Sandy and they drove to the nearest ATM where she withdrew money. After this, they drove deep into the woods and Alejandro murdered his ex-girlfriend and left her body in a ditch. Alejandro's car was found abandoned a little bit outside of town, likely dumped by the murderers. But oddly enough, Sandy's car was found all the way in Arizona, basically on the opposite side of the country, where it was also abandoned. It was this discovery that allowed them to find surveillance footage of Alejandro and his girlfriend crossing the border into Mexico, where they currently reside. At least Alejandro still does. 3 months after they disappeared into Mexico, Alejandro's girlfriend actually turned herself in. Alejandro's girlfriend claims that one morning she woke up and Alejandro was simply gone, and with nothing else to do, she decided to turn herself in. And whether he simply abandoned her or she's telling a lie to cover his tracks, we may never know. But Alejandro, the 17-year-old murderer who's now 26, is still at large. Donald Eugene Fields II. Donald definitely looks like somebody who would be on this list. He was born on July 9th, 1964, is anywhere from 6 to 6'4" tall. He's a white male and has a scar on his chest and a few tattoos as well. Fields is on this list for an extremely unsavory reason. He's alleged to have trafficked at least one child in Missouri from approximately 2013 to 2017. It is believed that Donald was knowingly attempting to recruit, entice, harbor, transport, provide, maintain, and solicit a person who he believed to be under the age of 18 years old. To put it in regular speak, he was essentially trying to sell a child for sex. His last known location is Franklin County, Missouri, but he's been reported to have been traveling around the country since 2022. Fortunately, one of the people that Fields was selling this underage person to was caught and sentenced to over 30 years in prison, and he even admitted to giving cash, a car, a motorcycle, Christmas presents, and vacations in exchange for access to this 14-year-old that Fields was soliciting. Every time the FBI gets a tip about him, they are putting up billboards, signs, and Facebook ads in the city to get any information. But unfortunately, it seems that Fields is typically one step ahead, although I hope he is brought to justice very soon. Vitel Homme Innocent. Ironically, Vitel's last name literally translates to innocent man in French, but this man is far from innocent. Vitel is one of the leaders of Haiti's largest and most violent gangs. Besides his affiliation with a gang that has been terrorizing Haiti for years, Vitel is also personally connected to a string of murders and kidnappings. In 2021, Vitel and his gang collaborated with another gang to kidnap 17 Christian missionaries that were currently in Haiti. And if this sounds familiar, you've probably heard of the story before when it was happening because it was pretty high profile. profile. Disturbingly, out of all of these hostages, 5 of them were children, one of them being under 1 year old. But fortunately, they were all safely returned after this surely traumatic experience, after somebody paid an undisclosed amount of money. Initially, these gangs wanted $1 million per person, but who knows what they settled for. After this ransom was paid, Vitel's gang used this money to fund buying weapons, and later that year, the Haitian president was murdered, leaving a massive power vacuum and an opportunity for Vitel's gang to gain massive power in Haiti. In 2023, it's reported that this gang has up to 600 members, including children who are fighting against their will. Interestingly, Vitel offers a strange perspective into the life of crime in Haiti, whereas last year he actually did a full documentary with reporters where he showed off his lifestyle and even spoke to reporters about how he came to power and what his lifestyle is currently like. It goes without saying that Vitel is considered armed and extremely dangerous. For Vitel, the FBI is offering $2 million for anybody who can offer information leading to his arrest. But I think based on the brief that I gave about Vitel, it's understandable why this price is so high. And I also think it's no wonder how he's still on the loose today. Wilver Villegas Palomino. Wilver is a high-ranking member of the National Liberation Army, or ELN for short, which is a military movement which is active primarily in Colombia and Venezuela. ELN, similar to Craze Barry, the gang owned by Vitel, deals primarily with organized crime, specifically kidnapping, extortion, and even attacking oil infrastructure, basically eco-terrorism. And shortly after, in true Colombian fashion, got involved in the drug trade. Wilver personally is alleged to have killed multiple human rights activists in Colombia, as well as committing narco-terrorism, distribution of drugs, murder, and other similar charges. Wilver and his gang of ELN is heavily attributed to the massive influx of drugs into the southern states in the USA. And for that reason, the FBI is offering up to $5 million for any information that can help bring him to justice. Currently, there is absolutely no information available about where Wilver may reside. Although, if you have any clue, you might be $5 million richer. Ruja Ignatova. Although this person is definitely not a good person, compared to some of the other people on this list, Ruja is going to seem like a petty thief. Ruja is a Bulgarian woman, and she was an entrepreneur, or so she was believed to be. Ruja was the founder of OneCoin Limited, which was a Bulgaria-based company that was marketing and purporting cryptocurrency. I'm sure as soon as it said cryptocurrency, you saw where this was going. OneCoin was defrauding billions of dollars from their investors all over the world. And in order to make her scheme as big as it was and go on as long as it was, Ruja was allegedly making false statements and representations to individuals in order to solicit more investments in OneCoin. Basically, more or less of your run-of-the-mill Ponzi scheme, and very similar to what happened recently with FTX, which was another huge cryptocurrency scandal. Throughout the entirety of its scheme, OneCoin is believed to have defrauded over $4 billion out of investors, which is insane. Ruja's company was officially charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, conspiracy to commit securities fraud, and securities fraud. And currently, Ruja is on the run. On October 12th, 2017, Ruja was charged in the United States District Court, and today they were offering up to $5 million for any information that leads to her arrest or conviction. Note to self, do not buy into cryptocurrency pyramid schemes. I'm not anti-crypto, but I'm definitely anti-scam, and OneCoin was a huge scam. Arnaldo Jimenez. This man is absolutely vile, as is everybody on this list, but the specific details of this story just made me feel gross. On May 11th, 2012, Arnaldo got married to his wife, and only one day later, on May 12th, Arnaldo is alleged with murdering his wife by stabbing her to death in the back of his Maserati. He's alleged to, at that point, taken her dead body from his vehicle and putting her in the bathtub of her apartment, where he left her and then seemingly vanished. When Arnaldo's wife was not replying to any of her family's calls or texts and didn't pick up her children from school, her family called the police, where they did a wellness check and found her body in her tub, still in her wedding dress. Arnaldo is believed to be somewhere in Mexico, but unfortunately after 12 years and hundreds of tips, nothing has brought the FBI any closer to bringing this man to justice. After the murder, phone records were able to trace Arnaldo across multiple states across the country and even ended with him in Texas, extremely close to the Mexican border. But unfortunately, that's where the records ended, and once he entered Mexico, there has been absolutely no sightings of him. Hopefully, Arnaldo was caught and serves life in prison for the crimes he's committed. But from what we've seen so far on this list, it seems that going to Mexico is a pretty good way to avoid jail time. Omar Alexander Cardenas. Omar's case is short and simple, but no less disturbing, as he is charged with murdering a man in broad daylight, with footage of him walking to and waddling away from the place where he committed this murder. Omar is another young entry on this list, being only 29 years old at the time of recording this video, and even younger when this crime happened. And while his crime is essentially caught on camera, not much is known about him besides the fact that he's 5'7" and 300 pounds, which is a crazy build. On August 15th, 2019, Omar walked to an open-air shopping center where he stood in front of a barbershop, pulled a pistol out of his pants, and shot at the head of one of the people in the barbershop, who he instantly killed and then seemingly just casually walked away. With how brazen this murder was and the fact that it was in public, in broad daylight, and even caught on camera, to me it's honestly crazy that this man is still walking free today. Being a most wanted criminal has allowed the FBI to get a lot more tips and information about this individual, but unfortunately nothing has been able to help them find him. Likely because, like others on this list, he too fled the country to avoid prosecution. Yulan Adonai Archaga Carayes. MS-13 is one of the most violent criminal organizations in the world, active primarily in South America, specifically Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, but currently are active in Mexico and the United States as well. Yulan here is the alleged leader of the MS-13 in all of Honduras, making him responsible for a lot of shenanigans, to say the least, such as drug trafficking, human trafficking, extortion, kidnapping, and extreme acts of violence. Yulan specifically is wanted in the US for trafficking multi-ton loads of cocaine into the United States, as well as murder and a laundry list of others. Crazily, Yulan was actually apprehended and charged in court for the murder of 2 Honduras prosecutors, when during his trial, 20 armed men dressed in the same uniforms as the anti-gang unit walk into the court hearing and seconds after unload on the entire room. 4 police officers were killed, and Yulan was once again a free man. The power that these criminal organizations have in South America is honestly scary and strongly rivals the government, although some would argue that the two are intertwined. Although this man is only 5'5" and 160 pounds, he's one of the most powerful and deadly men in Honduras and likely in all of South America. And it's not necessarily shocking that the FBI is willing to offer up to $5 million for information leading to the conviction or arrest of Yulan. Alexis Flores. Alexis is another man from Honduras, although he is even shorter and smaller than the previous entry. He stands at a staggering 5'4" tall and weighs only 130 pounds. But his alleged crime is absolutely sickening. To put it bluntly, Alexis Flores is alleged to have kidnapped and strangled to death a 5-year-old girl in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This young girl was reported missing in July of 2000 and was found a few weeks later lifeless in the basement of an abandoned apartment building in August of 2000. Unfortunately, for this crime, there was little to no evidence and the case went cold for multiple years. The only piece of evidence they had was a strange t-shirt. It wasn't until 7 years later in 2007 when DNA analysis advancements were far enough along where they were successfully able to find a matching DNA sample to someone that they arrested years prior for shoplifting and forgery. They finally had a lead and a perfect DNA match, closely linking this criminal to at least the owner of this t-shirt, which was directly at the crime scene. Although when they found out who this t-shirt belonged to, they had a whole new problem that they had to solve. They knew they had their guy, Alexis Flores, but when searching the database, they also saw that Alexis Flores was no longer in the United States. Alexis was actually deported years prior for other unrelated charges, and unfortunately, the authorities had no idea where he was. It's pretty shocking how somebody can do something once again so brazen in broad daylight and have absolutely nobody report or see anything, at least anything that was able to bring him to justice. Bhadresh Kumar Chetanbhai Patel. Ladies and gentlemen, before we get into the disgusting actions of the last person on the FBI's most wanted list, I just wanted to mention 2 quick things. When doing research for this video, I not only researched those who are currently on this list, but I also made a list of some of the most infamous people that have ever been on this list that has existed for over 70 years. And although YouTube doesn't necessarily love videos on these topics, if you guys want that video, I'd be more than happy to make a video about the most infamous people to ever be on the list. So leave a like or leave a comment letting me know you'd be interested in that video. And while the FBI most wanted list is definitely the most famous list, there is also another list full of dangerous criminals. That list is the US Marshals most wanted list, and they currently have 15 extremely dangerous criminals listed on there. So if either of those videos are something that you'd want to see, I'd be more than happy to cover. Just let me know by leaving a like or a comment. Now let's proceed with our final entry. Bhadresh Kumar shares a very similar and disturbing similarity to the first entry on this list. Bhadresh Kumar and Alejandro both worked at restaurants with their significant others. Bhadresh Kumar worked at a Dunkin' Donuts with his wife, and it's at that same Dunkin' Donuts where Bhadresh Kumar's wife would pass away. Customers entered this Dunkin' Donuts and called police after realizing that there was no employees at the store whatsoever. And once police entered the store, they checked in the back and found a lifeless employee. This employee being the wife of Bhadresh Kumar. Security footage pointed obviously to Bedrish Kumar murdering his wife, as there was footage of both of them stepping in the back room and only Bedrish Kumar leaving the back room before he fled the scene. Bedrish Kumar was last seen taking a taxi from a hotel in New Jersey to a train station in Newark, where he hasn't been seen or heard from since. Hence why the FBI was so eager to put him on this list, as without any information or tips, this man is walking the streets free, and nobody wants that. After doing research for this video, I have two pretty crazy takeaways, and I want to know yours as well. To me, it seems so crazy that some people can just get away with such brazen and crazy crimes, and it also seems extremely saddening how simply going to Mexico can be a get-out-of-jail-free card. If you happen to know anything about some of these people, drop a tip at the FBI, and you might just be a little bit richer. The most notorious fugitives ever on the FBI's most wanted list. About a month ago, I made a video about the FBI's most wanted list, and in that video I said if you guys wanted a separate video about the most wanted criminals ever, I'd make it. And well, here we are. Today, we're discussing the most notorious criminals to ever be on the FBI's most wanted list. And as a fair warning, this video gets crazy, and you're definitely gonna recognize some names on this list. Let's get right into it. Thomas James Holden. I knew I had to put James at the very beginning of this list, well, because it was symbolic. Thomas James Holden was the first criminal ever to be on the FBI's most wanted list, and is very likely one of the reasons why this list was even invented in the first place. Thomas was a career criminal and started his life of crime long before the FBI's most wanted list was even established. In 1926, James Holden and his partner, Francis Keating, led the Holden-Keating gang. This gang specifically specialized in committing robberies. And they weren't your old-timey purse snatcher. They were robbing banks, hijacking trucks full of money, and even held up trains, among other things. Although this gang's reign of terror didn't last long, as 2 years later, in 1928, Holden and his partner were sentenced to 25 years in prison. Although after only serving 2 years, he escaped from prison and immediately started a new gang, where once again, his career continued, and he was robbing trains, buses, and banks up until 1931 when he was captured again. After his capture in 1931, Holden served time in Alcatraz and was later paroled in 1947. But of course, that's not where the story ends. In 1949, 2 years after being released from prison, Holden murdered not only his wife, but also two of her relatives during a domestic dispute. After committing these murders, he fled the state, and it was this horrific crime that earned him a spot on the first ever FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, which was officially released a year later in 1950. Holden was caught only a year later in Oregon, working a normal job and using a fake name. And after his trial, he was convicted of murder later that year. Holden died only a few years later while in prison. James was undoubtedly a horrible person, but I find this story interesting because his life of crime started long before the FBI's most wanted list. And it was partly his actions along with the actions of other career criminals that inspired the FBI to make a most wanted list, to get support from the public. And immediately after this first list was published, its usefulness became instantly obvious, as it took less than a year for the FBI to find Holden after murdering his wife and two other men. So yeah, Holden was the first man ever on the FBI's most wanted list, and for that reason, I knew I had to put him on this list, and I figured why not put him first. Quick note that this video is in no specific order. I'm not ranking these people. None of these criminals are better or worse than each other. I'm not going to incentivize that. These people don't deserve that. All of these people are horrible and have done horrible things. But yeah, let's keep going. Eric Rudolph. Eric Rudolph is a domestic terrorist, better known as the Olympic Park bomber, and he was responsible for numerous bombings and murders from 1996 to 1998, most notably including the bombing of Centennial Olympic Park during the 1996 Summer Olympic Games in Atlanta, Georgia. This bombing killed 2 people and injured over 100 others, and this was also the first of many bombings he committed. The other bombings he eventually confessed to make his motives rather clear, as he targeted and bombed 2 separate abortion clinics within Georgia, followed by bombing a lesbian bar, and then that bombing was followed by his final bombing, which was of another abortion clinic in Birmingham, Alabama. This final bombing killed a police officer and injured a nurse, among other people. Rudolph used homemade bombs that he filled with nails to maximize the damage, and he wanted to hurt people and send a message. Rudolph claimed to be against global socialism and abortion on demand, and he believed that the government was supporting both of these things. And during the 1996 Olympic Games, he saw these games as a promotion of global socialism, and he thought that the government supporting this was completely unacceptable. And because he was already upset that the US government was supporting abortion rights, he decided to go and hurt and kill innocent people. What a lunatic. In 2005, Rudolph pled guilty to multiple homicide charges and actually received 4 consecutive life sentences as a part of a plea bargain. Yeah, that was his plea deal, 4 consecutive life sentences. However, this plea bargain did allow him to avoid the death sentence, which, I mean, I'll let you form your opinion on how you feel about that. Regardless, he is currently incarcerated at the ADX Florence Supermax prison in Colorado, and is also one of the most notorious criminals ever on the FBI's most wanted list. Ted Bundy. Bundy is a name that I would bet money you've heard before, and I've even talked about him numerous times on this channel, so I'm gonna keep this segment a bit brief. But I did want to toss out Ted Bundy early in this list because I figured some of you guys would be looking for names you'd recognize, so here's one. And don't worry, there's more later in the list you'll definitely recognize. Back to Ted. Ted is undoubtedly one of the most notorious serial killers of all time, and also one of the most notorious people to ever be on the FBI's most wanted list. Bundy is responsible for the abduction, sexual assault, and murder of at least 30 young women and girls during the 1970s, and his crimes happened all across the United States of America. Bundy's typical methods of luring his victim would be by pretending to be injured or disabled, or by pretending to be an authority figure, such as a police officer. And typically what he would do once he has people's attention and trust is he would lure these young women to his car under the guise of requiring some help putting something in the trunk, typically. At that point, he would bludgeon these women unconscious and then put them in his vehicle, and then what he did from that point is just diabolical. And it's very likely you already know what he was up to. Not only would he sexually assault and kill these women, but he would also sexually assault their dead bodies and even mutilate them, keeping parts of these bodies as trophies. And that's really only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to his depravity. Bundy was actually caught and escaped from prison twice, and on his 3rd time in prison, he was eventually given the death penalty, where he was executed in 1989, ending his reign of terror. And if you're curious about exactly how Ted Bundy got caught, check out this video on screen after this video. I'll link it in the description for you. It's a video where I describe how the most infamous serial killers got caught. So yeah, Ted Bundy is not only one of the most notorious people ever on the FBI's most wanted list, he's also one of the most notorious serial killers and criminals of all time. And if you are familiar with his story, it's rather unfortunate how he was able to get away with his horrific acts for so long. But that's a story for a different video, and I have videos on my channel where I go into detail about that. Check out the serial killer series on this channel if you're interested. Let's keep moving. Victor Manuel Herdena. Victor is a notorious entry on the FBI's most wanted list for a few reasons. Firstly, because he was on the list for the longest time ever. Like, more than anybody. Like, nobody spent more time than him on the list. So I'm assuming he was pretty good at hide and seek as a kid. But seriously, jokes aside, he spent over 32 years on the list as a most wanted fugitive and was not captured ever. The only reason that he was removed from the list on December 15th, 2016 is more or less because he no longer met the requirements, which really means they decided that other criminals were more worth pursuing and having on the list. Victor was officially added to the list on May 14th, 1984, and the reason that he was added to this list was for a crime that also makes him a notable entry on the FBI's most wanted list as a whole, because he is associated with one of the largest cash robberies in US history. On September 12th, 1983, while working for Wells Fargo, Victor plotted and conducted a theft of over $7 million cash from a Wells Fargo armored car facility in Connecticut, which is just an absolutely insane feat, and adjusted for inflation, it only gets crazier. In today's money, he stole the equivalent of roughly $19 million cash. After this robbery, it is believed that he was smuggled to Mexico, and it is believed that he is now somewhere in Cuba. So yeah, Victor is on this list for a few reasons. The insane heist he pulled off, the fact that he was able to not only escape the police, but also the country, and the fact that he was able to not be caught for over 32 years while being a most wanted criminal is absolutely insane. It's a bit of a nice palate cleanse to be able to discuss a bank robbery instead of some of the other things we've discussed and will continue to discuss, because unsurprisingly, the most wanted of the most wanted are a depraved bunch. And with that, let's get to our next entry. Ramzi Youssef. I would assume everybody watching this video is familiar with the terrorist attack that took place on September 11th. However, that wasn't the only attack that took place in the World Trade Center. In 1993, a terrorist attack masterminded by Ramzi Youssef took place in the World Trade Center, and it claimed the life of 6 innocent people and injured over 1,000 others. Hours after the attack, Ramzi fled the country, and for that reason, he was put on the FBI's most wanted list. While on the run and on the most wanted list, he also essentially co-founded the Pachinko plot, which was an elaborate scheme to carry out multiple large-scale attacks and create essentially global terror. The Pachinko plot, simply put, was a plan to kill the Pope as a distraction, and then while people were distracted by the murder of the Pope, 11 planes on the way to the USA would be hijacked and bombed. Which is an absolutely insane thing to consider, that this was a serious plan that people were putting money, energy, and effort towards. Fortunately, this plan failed, and in 1995, Ramzi was arrested in Pakistan while he was attempting to put a bomb in a toy doll. At this point, after his capture, he was extradited back to the United States. Ramzi, along with 2 of his co-conspirators, were convicted for their roles in the 1993 bombing and the Pachinko plot. And Ramzi specifically received 2 life sentences plus 240 years for his involvement in these acts of terror. The story ends there, but I do have a few interesting facts. One of Yusuf's uncles is actually credited as one of the principal architects behind the September 11th attacks. And Yusuf is currently behind bars at the same prison that Eric Rudolph is at, the ADX Florence in Colorado. Also, interestingly, this is the same facility where Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was also held. But I guess it makes sense. These are all extremely dangerous people. Rafael Caro Quintero. During the time that Rafael was on the FBI's most wanted list, he was actually the record holder for the highest reward offered by the FBI for information. That reward being $20 million, which now is a bit more common and that record has been broken, but at the time, the FBI was not messing around and they wanted this guy. For good reason too, as Rafael is one of the most notorious Mexican drug lords of all time and is the co-founder of the Guadalajara cartel, one of the earliest and most powerful drug trafficking organizations in Mexico. Rafael was a kingpin in the drug trade during its boom in the 1980s, known mostly for his brutal tactics and massive influence and power. Rafael is most infamous for his involvement in the 1985 kidnapping and murder of a DEA agent. And this specific murder severely strained the relationship between the US and Mexico. Fortunately, Rafael was caught and was sentenced to 40 years in prison, but unfortunately, he was actually released early in 2013 due to a legal technicality. That being that a lawyer argued that his trial should have been at the state level and not the federal level. And I suppose that was enough to have him released from jail, which is insane. When news broke that this drug lord who killed an American official was released from jail, all hell broke loose. And only days after his release, the Mexican and American governments put him back on the most wanted list. However, it did take them 9 years to catch him again. And from 2013 to 2022, he was a free man until he was once again captured by Mexican authorities in 2022 and was extradited back to the United States to stand trial, specifically for drug trafficking charges. Rafael's full story and list of crimes goes far beyond the scope of this video, but trust me when I say, not only did his story at the time make headlines, but he is also definitely one of the most dangerous and notorious entries ever on the FBI's most wanted list. Semyon Mogilevich. Mogilevich is another criminal we've actually talked about on the channel before. And if you've seen that video, then you would know that Mogilevich is known as the boss of bosses, or the most powerful and dangerous gangster in the world. A pretty crazy title, but his crime resume definitely backs it up. Keep in mind, that's not a name he gave himself. That name was given to him by the FBI. Semyon is alleged to have built a vast criminal empire with involvement in every illicit activity you can think of, including extortion, money laundering, drug trafficking, human trafficking, weapons trafficking, murder for hire, fraud, and much more. One of his most notable accusations is his multi-million-dollar stock scheme he actually performed in Canada, where him and a group of associates were able to scam over $150 million out of investors by essentially having a fake company listed on the TSX, the Toronto Stock Exchange. Mogilevich is considered to be the most dangerous and most powerful criminal because his power comes from the sheer power of his network. Not only is he himself an educated and well-connected and rich person, but he is also connected to every rich crime boss globally, making his influence extremely dangerous and extremely powerful, which is why in 2009 they put him on their list. However, in 2015 he was actually removed from the list as there is no extradition treaty between the US and Russia, meaning that Russia has no incentive to send this criminal to the States. And for that reason, the FBI thought it made sense to put somebody else on the list that they had a better chance of getting. Although that doesn't mean that he's any less wanted or any less dangerous. Although, as of now, he is still a free man. James Earl Ray. The infamy and story of this individual is likely the most interesting and twisted by far. James Earl Ray was a small-time criminal who was arrested and eventually escaped from jail. And a year after escaping from jail, he allegedly assassinated Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4th, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. Following this assassination, Ray fled the United States, got a Canadian passport, and then traveled to London where he was recognized and caught. And the following year, he pled guilty to the crime and was sentenced to 99 years. Now that is a very simple story, but that's where the lines begin to get blurred. Because although assassinating one of the most famous civil rights leaders of all time is definitely going to earn you a spot on this list, that's not quite what everybody believes. In 1977, Ray actually escaped from prison again, and this second escape from prison would put him back on the FBI's most wanted list. I kind of forgot to mention, but the first time he was put on the FBI's most wanted list was after his alleged assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Regardless, after escaping from jail for a second time, he was caught after a 54-hour manhunt. Now, interestingly, after being re-caught and re-put in prison, Ray began to renounce his guilt, essentially saying the confession gave before wasn't true and I actually didn't do it. Now, this raised a lot of questions because at the time, and even to this day, people theorized that the death of Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't by some small-time criminal, but potentially by the government. Unfortunately, Ray never had any evidence to present that he wasn't guilty and that the government was. Most interestingly is that MLK Jr.'s family believe that Ray is not the killer, and they supported his motion to have a retrial and are very vocal about the fact that they believe that it was a government conspiracy. However, no matter how you feel about it, the judge, the government, the FBI ultimately decided that this was definitely Earl James Ray, and the case at that point was closed. Was James Earl Ray framed, or was he the assassin? I don't have an opinion on this yet, but I'm curious to know what you guys think. So yeah, James Earl Ray is one of the most notorious people on the list for allegedly assassinating one of the most famous figures in political history, and also for the conspiracy surrounding his alleged involvement. Crazy stuff, but we still got 2 more to cover. William Bradford Bishop Jr. Bishop had a seemingly perfect life. He graduated from Yale, worked as a U.S. Foreign Service officer, married his high school sweetheart, and had 3 sons with the love of his life. Now, obviously, you don't end up on this list for having a picture-perfect life. As the story goes, Bishop was denied a promotion at his job, and for that reason, he left work, withdrew a large amount of cash from the bank, purchased a ball-peen hammer, a gas can, and other supplies, went home, and then allegedly murdered his entire family, including his wife, his own mother, and his 3 sons. He then transported their bodies to North Carolina, where he buried them in a shallow grave and set them on fire, and then left the scene. Bishop's car was later found abandoned in Tennessee's Great Smoky Mountains National Park near the Appalachian Trail, where his car, full of personal items, linked him directly to the murders. However, despite multiple sightings in the US and even in Europe, Bishop has been able to evade capture ever since these murders took place. It is suggested he has done so because he is fluent in 5 languages, is an experienced outdoorsman, and his skills and background with his job made him particularly elusive. Although these murders of his entire family took place in the 70s, it wasn't until 2014 when he was added onto the list. And only 4 years later, in 2018, he was then removed from the list because the FBI stated that they wanted to focus on more recent cases. But that doesn't mean that they aren't still searching for him, but they're just not prioritizing this one to get the most wanted list exposure. To this day, Bishop could still be alive, and at this point would be 89 years old. And it is rather unfortunate how he was never able to be brought to justice, and I find it a bit odd that he was added to the most wanted list so far after he committed such heinous activities and essentially got away with it. But regardless of timeliness, he was an entry on the FBI's most wanted list, and a very notorious one at that. Now, let's get into the final entry on this list. Osama bin Laden. While this video isn't in any particular ranking, I figured it made sense to put Osama last, as he is likely by far the most recognizable person on this entire list. Osama definitely didn't need the help of the FBI's most wanted list to gain notoriety, although it did help bring awareness about this terrifying individual. Osama bin Laden is the founder of Al-Qaeda, a militant organization responsible for numerous terrorist attacks, most famously including the September 11th attacks that killed nearly 3,000 people. And while that attack is how most people are aware of Osama bin Laden, his criminal history, and even his time spent on the FBI's most wanted list far predate the September 11th attacks. Osama was actually on the FBI's most wanted list as early as 1993, mostly because of his involvement in Al-Qaeda and the numerous terror attacks that they were committing, one of which being the Mogadishu bombing, in which Somali rebels trained by bin Laden and his partners killed 18 American servicemen. That same year, Osama was also tied to the first attack on the World Trade Center, the one that we discussed previously that was primarily masterminded by Yusuf. His ties to that attack in the Mogadishu bombing were more than enough to land him a spot on the most wanted list. But that's obviously not where the story ends. 2 years later, in 1995, he attempted to have the Egyptian president murdered, and in 1996, he bombed a US Air Force complex in Saudi Arabia. And then in 1998, over 200 people died as a result of bombings in the US embassies in both Kenya and Tanzania, both of which Al-Qaeda took credit for, which means that they were directly linked to bin Laden himself. And of course, most famously, on September 11th, 2001, bin Laden was tied to an attack that not only made him one of the most wanted people by the FBI, but one of the most wanted and most known criminals in the entire world. And following that attack, the FBI put a $25 million reward on any information that would lead to the capture of Osama. From 2001 until 2011, Osama was able to live freely, although in hiding, until May 1st of 2011, when SEAL Team 6 stormed his compound and ended his reign of terror for good. Osama bin Laden was on this list for nearly 2 decades and is likely responsible for more deaths than anybody else on this list, and is not only one of the most notorious people to ever be on the FBI's most wanted list, but one of the most notorious criminals and terrorists of all time. The most wanted fugitives in Japan. If you're watching this video, you've probably heard of the FBI's most wanted list, a list of criminals most wanted by the United States government. This list has existed for almost a century, and if you're a regular viewer of Trust Me Bro, then you would know that I've actually made 2 videos about the FBI's most wanted list. But did you know that in Japan they also have a most wanted list? Don't worry, I didn't either. But once I learned that Japan had a most wanted list, I was definitely intrigued. To be honest, I was even surprised to find out that Japan had crime in general. But to discover that they had a most wanted list was shocking. And trust me when I say this, the people on this most wanted list definitely earned their spot. And today, we're going to discuss who's on the list and what they did to get there. Let's get started. Hiroshi Kokure. Hiroshi was born in 1969 and stands at roughly 170 centimeters tall. And for the first part of his life, Hiroshi seemed to live a semi-regular life. He was a truck driver and typically kept to himself. That was until he met a girl he liked on one of his deliveries. This woman worked at a retail store and she happened to work there every time Hiroshi was dropping off inventory. Although this casual, friendly, professional relationship would quickly develop into something much darker, as Hiroshi was not only developing a crush, but also an obsession with this woman. Every time Hiroshi would make a delivery and this woman was working, he would plead and beg with her to please take her on a date. And eventually she caved in. Although it was on this date that she reluctantly went on that she realized how creepy this guy was. They drove around the city chatting, and the entire time the vibes were completely off. And when she made it clear that it was time to go home, Hiroshi made sure to take the longest way home possible. And unfortunately, when he dropped her off, he was able to learn and memorize her address. And after this date, this woman never saw Hiroshi again, as she would ignore him at her job, and anytime he would try to call her work or her home, she would ignore. That was until Hiroshi did something she could not ignore. On January 14th, 1998, after a few weeks of finally not being harassed at home or at work, this woman that Hiroshi had been harassing was starting to feel that her stalker had finally gotten bored. That was until she got home that day after work. She opened the door into her apartment just like any other day, and almost as soon as she closed her apartment door, she was attacked. She was held down and restrained by a mysterious man until she was able to look at this man's face and realize that this was Hiroshi. Hiroshi had broken into her apartment, and not only that, but he'd also now restrained her, and she had nowhere to go. Obviously panicking, she was calling out to her family, which she lived with, but nobody was responding. And over the course of the next 2 hours, it's reported that Hiroshi confessed his love to her, and they spoke for hours on end. That was until he got up and left her apartment. Once Hiroshi had got up and left the apartment, this woman was able to get onto her feet and wiggle out of the restraints that Hiroshi had put her in. And that's when she discovered what really happened. Hiroshi had murdered this woman's entire family. Her mom, dad, and grandma. All of her family that lived with her in this apartment. And although she herself survived, her life was forever changed. Now, with that being said, what happened to Hiroshi? To put it bluntly, nobody knows. Hiroshi, to the day of recording this video, is still on the loose. After 27 years of searching and over 2,500 tips submitted to the Japanese government, Hiroshi has never been caught. And now Hiroshi is in his mid-50s, and at this point may never be caught. The ultimate motive for these murders is still unknown, and Hiroshi is still at large. And because of this, Hiroshi is not only one of the most wanted criminals in all of Japan, his case is one of the longest running fugitive hunts in all of Japanese history. The Japanese government is currently offering over 3 million yen for any information that leads to the arrest of Hiroshi. And every year on the night of the murder, the Japanese government redistributes flyers in hopes that they will finally get a tip that brings Hiroshi to justice. Obara Katsuyuki. Katsuki was born in 1979 and stands at 170 centimeters tall, and is also wanted for murder. On June 28, 2008, Katsuki lured a 17-year-old girl to meet him at a 7-Eleven. This girl was friends with his ex-girlfriend, and he called her and asked her to meet up with him at the 7-Eleven because he told her that he wanted to talk to her about getting back with his ex-girlfriend. This girl agreed, and that night they met up at a local 7-Eleven. Although after their interaction, this girl was never seen again. At least, not alive. As 3 days later, on July 1st, 2008, her body was found, dumped in a river an hour away from the convenience store, and Katsuki was nowhere to be found. The autopsy revealed that this girl had been strangled and then bludgeoned in the head, and then dropped off a short bridge into the shallow river in a very rural area. But this isn't all that Katsuki did, as he not only allegedly murdered and dumped this woman's body, but he also tried to stage his own death. As near this river, he also reportedly intentionally crashed his car to make it seem like he suffered a brutal car accident. Now, ironically, the police didn't buy this at all, and this stunt only gave the police more evidence that this fugitive was likely the murderer, as his vehicle had blood and hair from the victim in it. And the location where this crashed car was found was highly unlikely to actually be a real crash, as the road was straight and visibility on this road was high, meaning that it was unlikely that a one-car accident would just happen randomly. But on top of the dumped body and dumped vehicle, Katsuki also dumped his own personal items near a local cliff, only 7 kilometers away from his home, to make it seem like he ended his own life by jumping off this cliff. Once again, the police were not buying this whatsoever. And although Katsuki has never been seen, they believe that he is still at large to this day. And if that is the case, then Katsuki is currently 43 years old and has been on the run for over 17 years. The Japanese government is currently offering up to 3 million yen for any information that leads to the arrest of Obara Katsuki. Mitate Shinichi. Mitate was born in 1979 and stands at 167 centimeters tall. He is described by the Most Wanted list as well-built, and notably has scars on his left forearm, above his right eye, and across the front of his forehead. And Mitate is wanted for murder and unlawful assembly with dangerous weapons. Mitate was a genius, but he was also a psychopath, and this combination quickly led him to mischief. And early in his adult life, he ended up starting a motorcycle gang with some of his other, less than considerate acquaintances. Mitate's gang was dangerous, and seemed to assault with almost no reason or discretion, which leads us to the night of the incident in question. In the early morning hours of September 2nd, 2012, Mitate and a few members of his gang entered a nightclub and ended up savagely murdering the 31-year-old restaurant manager. Mitate and his 11 henchmen beat this man in front of his friends in the VIP area of this club. And one of the most unfortunate parts about this gruesome sneak attack is that unless this crime was totally random violence, they likely had the wrong person, because the person that this gang had murdered had absolutely no gang ties and was not currently wanted by anybody, leading people to believe that this was simply a case of mistaken identity. Just imagine trying to go to the club to relax one night when all of a sudden you are savagely beaten to death by 11 Japanese gangsters with metal baseball bats, all because they thought you were someone else. Or for that matter, imagine if you just witnessed your friend be murdered only for you to question why anybody would want to do this, and knowing that you can't do anything to prevent it or to help him, unless you wanted to become their next victim. Fortunately, early that following year in 2013, 15 suspects in this murder were identified, and 9 of them were charged with unlawful assembly and manslaughter. However, one man was not arrested or charged at all. That man, of course, being Mitate Shinichi. It is reported that almost immediately after the murder, he fled directly to the Philippines, where he stays to this day. But unfortunately, that claim is not confirmed. And to this day, Shinichi has been on the run for over 13 years and is one of the Japanese government's most wanted fugitives, with the Japanese government offering over 6 million yen for any information that could lead to this crime lord's arrest. Koichi Hata. Hata is the youngest fugitive we've talked about on this list, and his case is the most recent. Hata was born in 1996, meaning that today he is only 29. Hata stands at 175 centimeters tall, and he is wanted for a hit and run, which could possibly lead to him walking away a free man if he can remain in hiding long enough. But I'll explain that later. Hata was known locally to be a troublemaker, someone who would be disrespectful in public, something that was a massive no-no in Japanese culture. He was frequently in legal trouble, was often belligerent in public, and while the extent of his crimes and disorderly conduct were typically tame, what he did on June 29th, 2022 was anything of the sort. Around 3 a.m. on the morning of the incident, Hata was walking through a parking lot towards his car, playing music loudly from his phone, which was in general uncalled for, but especially at that hour, very disrespectful. and 2 university students getting on their motorcycles mentioned to him that he should potentially turn down his music. Hata didn't want to be lectured by 2 university students and shooed them off. The students got on their motorcycles and rode away. They left the parking lot and only got maybe half a kilometer down the road when they hit a red light. These 2 friends were likely talking to each other at this red light, potentially discussing the weirdo they just ran into, when they heard something abrupt. They heard the rev of an engine and headlights heading directly for them, seemingly out of nowhere. And in a flash, both of these men were struck by a car that was going anywhere from 80 to 100 kilometers per hour, sending these 2 students and their motorcycles flying, and unfortunately, leaving one of them dead on the scene. After striking these 2 students, Hata lost control of his vehicle and struck a light pole, where he abandoned his car and fled the scene on foot, where he was never seen again. At least, not by law enforcement. Almost all of Hata's personal items were in the vehicle that was left, and a bit further away from the crime scene, the police found his shoes and shirt. And while thousands of tips have been submitted directly to the Japanese officials, at the time of recording this video, Hata is still on the loose. However, there are a few theories about his current whereabouts and method of escape. See, his shirt was found at a harbor near the edge of the city he lived in. Some believe that he, like another entry on this list, tried to leave items near water to insinuate that he had ended his life in the water. Others believe that he tried to swim but likely ended up drowning accidentally, and some people believe neither of these. In Japan, CCTV is everywhere. However, in the harbor of the city that Hata lived in, there was little to no surveillance anywhere, making the harbor a perfect place to essentially disappear. Some believe that Hata ditched his shirt at the harbor so he could leave the scene looking like a shirtless jogger, and allowing him to run in between cities without being at least immediately detected by cameras. Regardless of the theories, the fact is that Hata is still on the loose. And as if this cold-blooded murder and attempted murder wasn't enough, the way that the police had been treating this case is more than upsetting and will likely make your blood boil. You see, when the police arrived at the crime scene shortly after it happened, the police immediately had access to Hata's home address via his ID that was in the wallet that he abandoned at the crime scene. Although they didn't go to his home address until 2 days after the incident, giving him plenty of time to get away. And on top of this, the crime that Hata is being charged is not murder, but actually hit and run, which may sound potentially accurate, but there's a major issue with that. And in Japan, all traffic violations have a statute of limitations of 7 years, meaning that if you commit a traffic violation and don't get caught or charged for it within 7 years, you are by default not guilty and can no longer be charged. However, in Japan, if you are charged with murder, there is no statute of limitations, which is a good thing, because if you murder somebody in Japan, it doesn't matter if it takes them 50 years to find and charge you. If you murdered someone and they can prove it, you are going to jail. Here's the issue. The family of the victim is urging the Japanese government to please switch Hata's charge from a hit run to murder, because as of now, Hata is still on the run, and there is a chance that he may not be caught within the 7-year period that he can be charged for this hit and run. And if the Japanese government only tries to charge Hata with a hit and run and not murder in 7 years, or at this point in 4 more years, if Hata is able to remain in hiding, there is a good chance that he will walk away serving no time for literally murdering a man in cold blood. Understandably, people are extremely upset about this, and although the Japanese government is offering 3 million yen for any information that leads to Hata's arrest, a private group is also offering an additional 5 million yen for any information leading to his arrest, which goes to show how much people want this case to be solved and how much they want Hata to be brought to justice. The refusal from the Japanese government to switch the charge from hit and run to murder after hundreds of thousands of people have pleaded with them to change the charge says a lot, and I feel so strongly for the family of the victim. The 4 cases I've just discussed are the cases that the Japanese government are most eager to solve. They have the most information, the most infamy, and they also have the highest bounties. And every other YouTube video about Japan's most wanted list only discuss these 4 fugitives. However, they're not the only criminals on the most wanted list. And because this is Trust Me Bro, and we make some of the best videos around, I'm gonna quickly speed round all of the other criminals on Japan's most wanted list that nobody else has talked about. For good reason, I'm not throwing shade, there's really not too much information available, but there's enough to at least briefly discuss, so let's go through it quickly. Lin Shaowei. Lin Shaowei was born in 1973 and stands at 178 centimeters tall and is wanted for robbery and murder. On October 1st, 1999, Lin was caught stealing from a pachinko parlor, and when called out by an employee, Lin ran out of the pachinko parlor and tried to escape, and once the employee caught up to Lin, Lin turned around and stabbed him in the chest. The man ended up passing away, and Lin is still on the loose to this day. Yoshaya Tsuyoshi. Yoshaya was born in 1977 and stands at 172 centimeters tall. He is reported to have curly hair, which, I mean, I don't know if this is Japanese curly, but it's definitely not curly. And he also has a round scar on his forehead, and he is wanted for murder. On June 4th, 1999, during a brawl between two biker gangs at an apartment building, Yoshaya and 12 other gang members assaulted two men and murdered one of them, the victim being 19 years old at the time. Yoshaya is believed to be the ringleader of this gang, and while all other 15 suspects were arrested, Yoshaya has never been caught, arrested, or charged, meaning that he still remains at large 26 years later. Miyachi Yodai. Miyachi was born in 1975 and stands at 177 centimeters tall, the tallest person we've discussed in this video, and he is wanted for robbery causing injury. Miyachi allegedly broke into a home, robbed it, and caused injury to the homeowners in 2013, and unfortunately no other information is currently available, besides the fact that he is still on the loose. Li Hui. Lee was born in 1963 and stands at 165 centimeters tall. He has a burn scar on his right hand and on his right thigh. On December 15th, 2000, Lee and his accomplices are alleged to have entered the house of a dentist, where they tied up two women that were sleeping in the home. They hit these women in the face and then stole their cash, their guns, and their jewelry, worth at the time over 43 million yen. Similar to other cases we've discussed, every other accomplice in this crime, in this case 5 other men, were caught and arrested. However, the leader of this operation, Lee, is still at large, and he's been on the run for over 25 years now. Ochi Kiyoshi. Ochi Kiyoshi was born in 1952 and stands at 175 centimeters tall. I believe he's the oldest person we've talked about on this list so far, and he's wanted for murder. Information about this man is extremely limited, and the exact description of this man on the Japan's Most Wanted website goes as follows. The suspect is wanted for the murder of his spouse. Doesn't get more simple than that. Matsuyoshi Takeo. Matsuyoshi was born in 1949 and stands at 172 centimeters tall. He is now the oldest person we've talked about so far in the list, and he is wanted for murder. Takeo is alleged and wanted for the murder of 2 police officers in Okinawa in 1990, and after 35 years, he is still on the run. And assuming he is still alive today, he is 76 years old, meaning that if you're in Japan or are just visiting Japan and you're walking down the street and see a normal seeming old man walk by, he actually might be a wanted murderer. That's a creepy thought. Ishikawa Tatsumi. Tatsumi was born in 1976 and stands at 158 centimeters tall, and he is wanted for, I quote, murder and violation of the act of controlling the possession of firearms or swords and other such weapons. And while that kinda sounds funny, his crime is no laughing matter. Tatsumi is suspected and wanted for a shooting and murder that took place on September 12th, 2017. You know, shootings are rare in Japan when we discussed the top 10 list, and guns have almost never come up. Tatsumi has currently been on the run for over 8 years. Japan is typically seen as nice, pretty, safe, and for that reason, I wanted to dig a bit deeper to see what the dark side of Japan looked like. And I think their most wanted fugitives list painted a pretty good picture for us. No place is perfect, and unfortunately, if people exist in a place, crime is also going to exist in that place. One thing I kind of gathered from doing research for this video is that a lot of people have issues with the Japanese prison system. And after looking at a few of these cases, I definitely see where they're coming from. It kind of seems like in some cases, the Japanese police and government would rather save face than admit to either being too lax or not being as thorough as they could have been. And for that reason, they would almost rather allow the public to do the research or to simply push the blame off themselves and reject questions altogether. But I'm curious, if you're familiar with any of these cases or have experience with the Japanese justice system, please let me know your thoughts in the comments. Every drug lord currently on the DEA's most wanted list. A couple weeks ago, I made a video about the FBI's most wanted list explained, and you guys seemed to love that topic. And in that video, I said if you guys wanted more videos about more lists, I would make them, and I'm a man of my word. So today, we're going to be discussing the DEA's most wanted list. The DEA is the United States Drug Enforcement Administration, and is essentially the governing body over all of drug activity in the United States. If you watched Breaking Bad, then you're probably pretty familiar. With that being said, let's discuss the drug lords that the DEA is currently looking for. Silvano Francisco Mariano. Silvano, also known as Rayo or Rayito, is a 5'9" male born in 1981. And it may be no shock that this drug lord is wanted for drugs. But let's make this a bit fun. Quickly think, what drug do you think this man was involved with, and what do you think his role was? Silvano allegedly operates secret laboratories for the Sinaloa cartel, and these laboratories produce fentanyl. Fentanyl that is made from precursor chemicals that is imported from China and processed into fully formed fentanyl in Mexico and then distributed into the United States. That's his alleged involvement from the DEA. And as far as his list of offenses, that's an entirely different story. Silvano is currently wanted for the following alleged federal violations: fentanyl importation conspiracy, fentanyl trafficking, and conspiracy to possess machine guns and destructive devices, and money laundering. I had to throw that in there. That's a pretty crazy list of alleged offenses, and I think it's no surprise that this man is considered armed and dangerous. And I also think it's no surprise that this man has a heavy reward for any information, that being $1 million. However, if you were looking to cash in, you are a bit late, because fortunately, this fugitive was actually captured at the time of recording this video, and I guess we'll see what happens from there. But despite being captured, they're still listed on the most wanted list. So if they're still on the list, I definitely wanted to include them in this video. It's nice to start the video on more of a positive note, with justice being served, although, as we'll quickly see, this isn't always the case. So let's keep going. Luborio Nunez Aguirre. Luborio is also known as Karateka, and is a bit of an older gentleman. He stands at 5'10", weighs 190 pounds, and was born in 1957, which means he either didn't save for retirement or just loves his job. Jokes aside, the crimes this man is alleged for are no laughing matter. Like the last fugitive, try to guess his involvement and drug of choice. Okay, pause if you need more time, but we're just gonna keep going. His list of alleged federal violations goes as follows: fentanyl importation conspiracy, fentanyl trafficking conspiracy to possess machine guns and destructive devices, and money laundering conspiracy. Now, does this sound at all familiar? Yeah, it's because it's basically the exact same as the first guy, which I suppose makes sense because this is the most wanted list, and these are some pretty heavy allegations. Oh yeah, his last known location actually is unknown as well too, so this guy could be anywhere, so that's good. But at least there is a $1 million reward available to anybody who can provide information on Luborio. I would potentially recommend looking at the local shuffleboard or potentially a retirement home, as I mean, he is of age to kind of be spending time there, and also those places do have a lot of drug activity, albeit typically of the legal variety. This man is once again also considered armed and dangerous. Let's move on. Alan Gabriel Nunez Herrera. You know what, real quick, before we get into this, I'm gonna say it because I've had comments in the past. I've famously mispronounced some Spanish words, like charo, el sabon is a Lorona. So now I try to pronounce them accurately, accent and all. But yeah, I want to get that off my chest because I can already hear it. Oh, why is he trying so hard to pronounce it? Like, no, you know what? We're here, we're doing it. Okay, but let's talk about Alan. Alan's a bit interesting because even less information is known about him than the previous two. Not only is his location unknown, but also his height and weight aren't even known. All we know is that he's male and born in 1993, making him the youngest entry on this list, actually. And with the lack of information, let's get to the alleged federal violations. All right, what do you think? Ready? Okay. Fentanyl importation conspiracy, fentanyl trafficking conspiracy, conspiracy to possess machine guns and destructive devices, and money laundering conspiracy. So far, this list has been pretty formulaic, but trust me, it doesn't stay that way for the entire time. But the first three, like literally the exact same laundry list, which I guess now, you know, if you're out there looking to get on this list, you have a pretty clear template of what you gotta do. But let's move on. Chwin Yip. I know the list so far has been a bit formulaic, but Yip is definitely here to shake almost everything up. His laundry list is extensive, and his reward is also the biggest we've discussed so far. Yip is 5'8", 150 pounds, and was born in 1953, so even older than the last old guy we talked about. Now, once again, guess. What was Yip's drug of choice, and what was his involvement? Did you guess Title 21, USC 846? Well, you'd be right, but you probably didn't guess that. And this is weird. This is the first person on the list where it just didn't tell us exactly what his alleged federal violations are. But don't worry, I did some digging and I got to the bottom of it. He's being charged with a huge chemical distribution scheme, specifically for anabolic steroids and for fentanyl precursor. And not only that, the US Attorney's Office has filed federal charges claiming that he is one of the world's largest anabolic steroid producers, which is insane because, I mean, he doesn't strike me as a bodybuilder, but maybe that's why he's gotten away with it for so long. Like, the dude is like 70 now. The specific drug crimes Yip has been alleged to commit is the following: conspiracy to possess with intent to distribute anabolic steroids, conspiracy to possess with the intent to distribute fentanyl precursor, conspiracy to import anabolic steroids and manufacturing anabolic steroids and fentanyl precursor with the knowledge that they are unlawfully imported. And it also appears that the government's already taken action to stop Yip in his tracks, because on November 18th, 2021, the US Attorney's Office seized a crypto wallet that was linked to him with over $2.3 million in it. Although, if he's one of the largest distributors in the world, it's very likely that that's really really only a drop in the bucket, but it's something. The thing about Yip that's interesting is that he wasn't necessarily importing or manufacturing drugs per se, but he was manufacturing and importing the precursors to these drugs, knowing that they would be bought and used to produce both fentanyl and steroids within the US and likely other countries as well. I'm assuming he did this to have some sort of distance and layer of plausible deniability, but due to the sheer scale that he was producing and importing, potentially fueled by greed, it eventually caught up with him, and obviously the DEA and US Attorney's Office is not buying it. Fortunately, there is a last known location for this man. Yip is still believed to live in Wuhan City, a city in China that became very famous in the last few years. And within Wuhan, he still owns and operates the YC Chemical Group. That's not crazy. What's crazy is the sheer volume that this business was doing according to these court documents, which stated that his company was responsible for producing and distributing approximately $280 million worth of anabolic steroids, with over 55 million of those being distributed directly to the US over the last 5 years. And it seems like with this scale, they weren't being exactly cautious either, as the YC Group was literally advertising the sale of illegal steroids on various websites. Funny enough, Yip in 2015 actually attended trade shows in the United States, bringing his company's vice president and sales manager with him to do negotiations with local business partners, which is to me just super ballsy. So yeah, pretty crazy. This is honestly a great example of why you should never judge a book by its cover, because the most wanted criminal so far on this list is someone that likely looked the most unassuming, being a 70-year-old, 5'8" old man, for lack of better words. It is not likely that Yip is armed and dangerous, although it is recommended by the DEA to not approach or apprehend him. And if you do submit a tip and they catch him, that's $5 million in your pocket. So he may be a good one to go for. But still, we're only just getting started. Ivan Arquivaldo Guzman Salazar. Okay, this man is the craziest we've talked about so far. And I know we just talked about a pretty crazy example with Yip, but this goes far beyond even that. Ivan is a 5'8", 165-pound male born in 1983. His last location is unknown, and his nickname is El Chapito. El Chapito literally translates to Little Chapo in English, and he is the son of El Chapo, the man who led the entire Sinaloa cartel until he was extradited to the United States back in 2017. Already starting off crazy, being the son of one of the most notorious drug lords of all time. That being said, actually, you know, I'm just gonna say this now. This is just a video about the drug lords that the DEA wants most right now. But if you guys are interested about the most notorious drug lords of all time, let me know. Doing research for this video, I found a lot of information about drug lords, including El Chapo and a lot of others. Candidly, talking about drugs and crime and all of these violent topics isn't really great for keeping a healthy channel on YouTube. So if it's not something you guys really want, I likely won't do it. Okay, back to Ivan. Ivan shares leadership roles in the Sinaloa cartel and its massive fentanyl trafficking operation. And his alleged involvement in that branch of the business includes coordination of fentanyl trafficking into the US, shipping fentanyl precursor chemicals from China to Mexico, and collecting drug proceeds from Sinaloa cartel members and associates. On top of this, he's also responsible for the coordination and trafficking of other controlled substances on behalf of the Sinaloa cartel. So already, this man's got a huge laundry list in an extremely famous and dangerous criminal organization. On top of just being involved on the drug side of things, Ivan also takes some responsibility when it comes to the security of the Sinaloa cartel's operations, specifically commanding the Cesarios, which are the armed forces that literally work under the Sinaloa cartel, whose main job is to protect and further expand the cartel's operations. Essentially, yeah, just like its own military police. He shares this responsibility with both his blood brother and his two half-brothers, meaning that there is 4 brothers total responsible for a lot of these actions, but it does appear that Ivan is the point of focus. It is worth noted that one of these brothers was extradited to the US and is currently imprisoned on drug charges and is going through the court proceedings. According to the DEA, the Sinaloa cartel is largely responsible for the massive influx of fentanyl into the US over the last several years, which is a big reason why the DEA wants Ivan so badly. And this is kind of proven by his bounty. Any information that leads to the capture of Ivan could get you up to $10 million cash. 10 times what they're offering for the first 3 entries on the list, and even double what they're offering the last entry on this list, who was a huge manufacturer and distributor. The Sinaloa cartels and cartels in general are extremely dangerous, so this is one person I definitely wouldn't want to mess with. And with that, let's move on. Oscar Noe Medina Gonzalez. Oscar is 5'8", 160 pounds, and was born in 1983, and his last location was unknown. He goes by the alias Panu, and he is also involved in the Sinaloa cartel. Although we're no longer talking about El Chapito, we're kind of still talking about him, because Oscar is his right-hand man and a high-level leader of the Sinaloa cartel. He is the day-to-day commander of the operations that goes on in the security department. This sounds way too official for what it is. According to the DEA, Oscar allegedly allegedly oversees each of the Chapito's regional commanders who are responsible for the security of their designated areas within Mexico, and the Chapito's gunmen, the Cesarios, who are used when needed to protect the trafficking operations or to assassinate rival cartel members, and other things like that. One thing that you might already be noticing is that there is a connection between these criminals, and I'll kind of touch on that more at the end of this video once we discuss everybody on this list. I think it's safe to say that Oscar is up to a lot of the same stuff that Ivan was up to, but as far as his alleged federal violations, he is accused of and wanted for continuing criminal enterprise, CCE, fentanyl importation conspiracy, fentanyl trafficking conspiracy, possession of machine guns and destructive devices. Yeah, you know, all the same stuff as the other guy. So these are basically the blanket charges they can give these people, but for the entries that I was able to find additional information about, you can really see how deep this goes. And in Oscar's case, he is definitely involved with, at the very least, machine guns and destructive devices. The fear tactics and sheer violence that these cartels are willing to use to maintain power is scary and honestly disgusting, and it's no surprise that this man is on this list. And with that, his reward being so high as well. The DEA is currently offering $4 million for any information leading to the arrest of Oscar. Kun Jung. Jung is a bit elusive, as we have no information about his height, weight, or age, or even last known address, although we know he's in China. And without much information about him being known, there is some information available about his activity in the trade. Jung follows a similar path to Yip, just at a smaller scale, and instead of owning a company, he works for a company that is manufacturing and supplying precursor chemicals and exporting them overseas. He doesn't work for the company that Yip owns, but he does work for a company that is doing the same things and producing the same chemicals. In 2021, a co-conspirator in Mexico purchased 25 kilograms of fentanyl precursor from Jung and his company on behalf of the Sinaloa cartel, and these chemicals were shipped directly from China to Mexico, where they arrived at the Guadalajara airport only a few days later. Fortunately, this 25-kilogram load was seized by Mexican law enforcement directly at the airport, and from that point forward, Jung was on their list. On April 4th, 2023, a federal grand jury returned an indictment against Jung and others, charging them with fentanyl importation conspiracy, fentanyl trafficking conspiracy, and money laundering conspiracy. Whether or not he actually makes it to the US, I guess we'll see. But right now, he is one of the DEA's most wanted individuals, and there is currently a $1 million reward for any information about him. Carlos Omar Felix Gutierrez. Carlos is 5'6", 165 pounds, and was born in 2000, officially the youngest entry on this list. And Carlos shares a lot of similarities with the first entry on this list, Silvano, specifically the fact that they both operated secret fentanyl laboratories in Mexico, and they both have been caught. They also both shared the same laundry list of alleged federal violations. So yeah, I'll keep this one brief, but I will quickly discuss how he was captured. On March 16th, 2023, Carlos and a partner was arrested by Colombian judicial police as they were getting off of a commercial flight in Bogota. They were arrested based on charges that were given to them by the federal grand jury in the Southern District of New York. Carlos, to this day, is in custody and is pending extradition hearings on the charges I mentioned earlier. And like Silvano, Carlos does have a $1 million reward for any information leading to his conviction. So although he has been captured, I guess you can still submit tips to help solidify the case and make sure he spends time in jail. Nemesio Cervantes. This man is possibly one of the most feared and powerful men on this entire list. He stands at 5'7" tall, weighs 150 pounds, and was born in 1966. His last known location is Mexico, and he is better known as El Mencho, the leader of the CJNG cartel. Nemesio is considered the most wanted criminal in all of Mexico and one of the most wanted criminals, not just drug lords, but criminals in the US as well. For a bit of perspective on how much the DEA wants Nemesio, they are offering a reward up to $15 million, the highest we've seen so far on this list. And for good reason too. Under his command, the CJNG became one of Mexico's leading crime organizations. And with that comes extreme violence, terror, and of course, drug trafficking. For a bit of perspective on how powerful this man really is, in 2012, when a unit of the Mexican Federal Police made it known that they were actively looking for El Mencho, CJNG gang members blocked several highways and roads in the Guadalajara metropolitan area by stealing and setting at least 37 cars on fire, blocking these roads. The blockades were placed in strategic routes to prevent the police reinforcements from leaving or coming into Guadalajara, and after the attacks were over, the police confirmed that El Mencho had escaped, and this attack by the cartel cartel was successful. Nemicio's gang and the Mexican police have had multiple firefights, leaving tens of officers and cartel members dead. I know this video isn't about violence, but the CJNG is an extremely violent cartel, and I figured I'd emphasize that point just so you guys know exactly what I'm talking about. Nemicio personally is wanted for drug trafficking, organized crime involvement, and undocumented possession of firearms. And if I had just said those charges initially, you would have definitely underestimated what this man was up to. So I figured the context was important. Nemicio is extremely powerful and capable of extreme violence and has the means to fight the Mexican police. So don't think you stand a chance trying to get this $15 million reward. On top of all of the violence, his cartel is heavily involved in the trafficking of drugs, an activity that is likely funding all of their weapons. Now, even with as crazy as this list has gotten, we still have one final entry to cover. Before we discuss the very last entry, I just wanted to share a quick observation. After reviewing this list in full, it's very obvious to see that the DEA is most focused on the fentanyl crisis currently happening in the United States. Everybody on this list is in some way connected, and a lot of this boils down to the Chapitos, who are currently running this entire operation and profiting billions off of the fentanyl crisis in the States. In the past, the Sinaloa cartel and cartels in general were making a lot of their money off of heroin and cocaine. However, now fentanyl seems to be all the rage, as it's cheaper, more potent, and because of that, more profitable and easier to smuggle. Once their father, El Chapo, was arrested, they quickly realized that fentanyl was a huge opportunity for their business and quickly began establishing connections with Chinese criminals who were creating the precursor for this chemical and willing to ship it directly to Mexico, where at that point, the Sinaloa cartel already had the means of manufacturing and the knowledge of trafficking to start distributing this new, highly profitable and highly deadly drug. So far, the DEA has seized over 2.5 million fentanyl-laced pills, over 231 pounds of fentanyl powder, and over 82 pounds of fentanyl precursor chemicals. All of these ingredients combined are able to make almost 23 million deadly doses, which is why the DEA is taking this as seriously as they are. And what you are seeing on screen is coming from the DEA directly. This is a slideshow that they made to show exactly who's involved, where it's happening, what they're doing, and what their goal is. And as you can see, it's a very simple process of the precursor being made in China, shipped to Mexico, being manufactured, and then from that point being distributed. Regardless of what you think about the war on drugs, I think we can all agree that fentanyl truly serves no purpose on the streets. With that being said, let's discuss the final fugitive on this list. Julian Arani Alcaga Carriez. Julian, we meet again. If you guys watched our video on the FBI's most wanted list, then this man may look familiar, and that's because he's on the FBI's most wanted list. And for that reason, I'll keep this segment brief, but I will give a quick overview. Julian is 5'5", 160 pounds, and born in 1982, and his last known address is in Honduras, which is in Central America. Thank you, everybody in the comments. He is on the FBI's most wanted list and the DEA's most wanted list for a few reasons, but primarily the fact that he is the suspected leader of the MS-13 gang in Honduras, which is an extremely violent gang. The reason why Julian is wanted in the US is because he is believed to be providing firearms, narcotics, and cash to gang members that are operating within the United States. And he is also believed to be responsible for ordering the murders of rival gang members. And the authorities believe that he is still active in Honduras. Julian is currently wanted for the following alleged federal violations: cocaine importation, racketeering conspiracy, possession and conspiracy to possess machine guns, and that's surprisingly it. It's interesting how a gang leader has less alleged violations than seemingly lower level cartel members. But I suppose with him being a suspected leader, he is keeping his hands clean and having others do the dirty work. Julian currently has a $5 million reward for any information available. Although, good luck. Dangerous criminals that are still on the loose. Or at least, were never caught. If you're a Trust Me Bro fan, then you would know that this list is only going to get more dangerous and more evil as the list goes on. So let's get started. On a chilly November day in 1971, a man calling himself Dan Cooper hopped on a Northwest Orient flight from Portland to Seattle. And he looked like any other traveler in his neat suit and tie, but Cooper had a wild plan up his sleeve. Shortly after takeoff, he handed a note to the flight attendant, revealing that he had a bomb in his briefcase, and he demanded $200,000 cash, 4 parachutes, and a refueling truck waiting for him at Seattle. As the plane touched down, the drama unfolded quietly. The authorities, though shocked, met his demands, trading the cash, parachutes, and fuel for the release of 36 passengers. Cooper kept a few crew members on the flight, and they took off again, aiming for Mexico City. Once again, shortly after takeoff, high above the remote forest of southwest Washington, under the cover of night, Cooper made a bold escape. He strapped one of the parachutes onto his back, secured the money, and jumped out of the plane through the aft door. The plane eventually landed without Cooper, kicking off a massive manhunt. Despite extensive searches and a lot of speculation, Cooper vanished, leaving behind only a few clues, including a decaying package of $5,800 found years later by a boy near Columbia, Columbia River. As you likely already know, or probably assumed by the title of this video, D.B. Cooper was never caught. I wanted to start this first segment with a story rather than just saying D.B. Cooper. One, because the story is just so interesting, and two, because I wanted to try a new format. What do you guys think? But if it wasn't already obvious, the first entry on this list is D.B. Cooper. D.B. Cooper is likely the most famous entry on this list, and he's also the most tame entry, meaning that his actions, although dangerous and scary, were not nearly as evil as compared to the other entries on this list. But I still want to take a deep dive going into the exact danger that D.B. Cooper put people in and the effects that this could have had if things went wrong. Okay, for starters, this was a literal hijacking on a commercial flight with 42 total people on the flight, 36 people including Cooper, and then also 6 staff, 2 pilots and 4 flight attendants. Now, it is my assumption that D.B. Cooper did not actually have a bomb and then that was just a bluff to get the authorities to comply with his demands. But if he did have some makeshift homemade bomb in his briefcase, things could have went a lot differently. For starters, if the bomb was made poorly, it could have detonated on its own at any point, causing all 42 people to die on this plane, assuming that the plane doesn't crash over top of people and kill more people. That alone would have been catastrophic and a huge tragedy. Now, fortunately, as we know, that wasn't the case, but what did inspire D.B. Cooper to put so many people's lives in danger? Well, like we mentioned, money. He requested $200,000 cash, which in today's money is equivalent to $1.5 million, which is no small sum of money. Now, whether or not you would act on this elaborate scheme to try to get $1.5 million is up to you, but personally, I have no interest in doing anything of the sort. And one thing I find kind of ironic is that D.B. Cooper was smart. Every part of this plan was calculated and executed perfectly, which leads me to believe that he was a smart and competent individual. I say this because with the skills he had and the planning he had, I don't doubt that he could have made this money honestly. But my assumption is that he must have had some sort of incident happen in his life to make him do something so crazy, which I would love to know that story, but I doubt we ever will. Anybody who's willing to hijack a plane, risk the lives of others, and steal money, in my books, is definitely dangerous. And in the eyes of the law, a criminal, which is why I added D.B. Cooper to this video. But honestly, Cooper was kind of a class act when it came to being a criminal. He didn't make a scene on the plane to scare any of the other travelers. He allowed all of the passengers off of the plane. Many of them didn't even know what was going on. He only kept a few staff members on the plane. One of the flight attendants on the plane said that he wasn't cruel or nasty at all and that he seemed confident and nice even. And once he got his money and parachute, he was gone. When he opened the aft door of the plane, the pilots even called back to him on the PA system and asked him if he needed help. And his last words were no, and we never heard from him again. So although I do not condone the actions of D.B. Cooper whatsoever, when it comes to dangerous criminals, I think that he went about it in a very interesting way, which is no doubt why his story is so famous and which is why I wanted to have him on this list. This, in my opinion, is probably the best case scenario when it comes to a plane hijacking situation. But let's keep going. Next up on our list, we have one of the most notorious gangsters of all time and one of the most elusive criminals in the entire world. He is known as the boss of bosses, and his name is Simeon Mikhailovich. If you're unfamiliar with Simeon, you're not alone, and this is likely because Simeon is not an infamous American gangster that's been portrayed in movies. He's not even American at all. He's of Ukrainian, Russian, and Israeli descent, but that doesn't mean his resume is any less qualified, or should I say blood splattered. I want to make very clear that I am not hyping up this person in any way, shape, or form. This person is not a good person. I'm simply speaking with emphasis for storytelling purposes. With that being said, let's get into some of Simeon's credentials. For starters, the nickname Boss of Bosses was not a self-given nickname. The government agencies of the European Union and the United States described Simeon as the boss of bosses of most Russian mafia syndicates in the world. And he is believed to be directing a multi-billion-dollar international crime empire. And he is described by the FBI as the most powerful and dangerous gangster in the world. Oh, yeah, and if that's not enough, he was literally in the top 10 fugitive list from October 23rd, 2009, all the way till December 17th, 2015. But after hearing all of this, you might be asking yourself, what did this knucklehead get up to that got him in so much trouble? And let me tell you, this is the exact list of charges that put him on the FBI 10 most wanted fugitive list. I'm reading this directly off Wikipedia. Fraud by wire, racketeer, influenced, and corrupt organizations act conspiracy, mail fraud, money laundering conspiracy, money laundering, arms trafficking, drugs trafficking, human trafficking, aiding and abetting, murder, smuggling, prostitution, securities fraud, filing false registration with the SEC, false filing with the SEC, falsification of books and records. And I'm sure there's more. So as you can tell, this guy's a little bit of a goofball. And I'm sure you probably noticed in that list there was prostitution. And I'm sure it means something else, but I think it's kind of funny to imagine this guy selling some ass when times were tough. But honestly, I can't judge. You gotta do what you gotta do. And if this channel goes under, I might have to do the same. Mikhailovich did a lot to acquire so much wealth, but one of the first things he did to start making money was trading foreign exchange currency, or Forex, which at the time in the USSR was illegal, which he was fined and charged for. And this is likely the catalyst catalyst that got him involved in organized crime. A lot of the wealth that he controlled came from a lot of high-level corporate scams. One of my favorites including a publicly traded company on the Toronto Stock Exchange. YBM Magnex Incorporated was a publicly traded stock on the Toronto Stock Exchange, which in only a short amount of time was able to grow by over 2,000%. Seemingly a promising company and a great investment opportunity. But that can be further from the truth. Mogilevich used his economics degree and deception to forge numbers in the company's accounting, making the company seem like it was growing substantially when in reality it was just laundering money. The headquarters of this company was raided once Canadian journalists caught on that these Russian mobsters were involved with this company, and the day after the raid, the company's stock became worthless almost overnight. I'm sure there was a few savvy investors who weren't too happy about this. It goes without saying that with somebody so influential, so powerful, and so rich in the organized crime world, there is no doubt that they are absolutely a dangerous individual. And because this video is focused on criminals and not killers, I figured I would keep the crimes I focused on pretty diverse. But if you are waiting for murder stories, the next entry is for you. But be warned, it is gruesome and extremely upsetting. The final entry on this list is a serial child assaulter from Australia. He is only known by the nickname Mr. Cruel. And his story is nothing less than evil. Now, if you've seen a few Trust Me Bro videos, then you would know that we use the word assault to reference something much more evil and disturbing. Something that YouTube wouldn't like me to say, and something that I honestly wouldn't like to say either. Mr. Cruel haunted Melbourne, Australia during the late 1980s and early 1990s. He's infamous for his calculated and sinister attacks targeting young girls in their homes. The way he operated was chillingly malicious. He would break into the family's homes at night, often while the family was still asleep. He would abduct, assault, and then later release the victims miles from their homes. He did this on 3 separate occasions to 3 separate victims, and the time that he kept these victims varied from 18 hours all the way up to 55 hours before they were released. What really set Mr. Cruel apart from other criminals with similar intentions was the fact that he had such a methodical approach to avoiding capture. He wore gloves and a mask, making sure to leave virtually no forensics evidence behind. He also took measures to confuse the police, like bathing his victims to remove any traces of DNA before releasing them. He literally thought of everything to cover his tracks, including instructing the kids not to look at him and using a very monotone voice to keep his voice generic and unrecognizable. The case that he is most known for is also the most tragic and is one that is still kept a mystery: the abduction of Carmen Chan in 1991. Unlike his other victims, Carmen was never returned home and was found deceased a year later. And unfortunately, after this case, there was absolutely no more evidence about Mr. Cruel or this case. Despite massive police efforts, including Operation Spectrum, which was specifically launched to catch just Mr. Cruel, he has never been identified. The case remains one of Australia's most troubling mysteries, not just because of the crimes he committed, but also the fact that he is still on the loose today. I don't think there's any debate or any further detail required on why Mr. Cruel is such a dangerous criminal, and it's truly upsetting and disturbing that he was never caught and justice was never served. Just for context of how slippery Mr. Cruel was, when the Spectrum Task Force was created in May of 1991, over the next 3 years, the police searched 30,000 homes, interviewed 27,000 suspects, and spent a total of $3.8 million and still collected no meaningful evidence. To this very day, there is still a $1 million reward for any information on Carmen Chan. In a lot of cases that end up going cold and unsolved, it's very easy to blame the police for negligence, but in this case, it definitely doesn't seem like there's a lack of trying, which in my opinion makes this case much more scary and much more upsetting. But with that being said, let me know what you guys thought of this video. I typically only cover killers, but in this video I wanted to cover criminals and make the video a bit more dynamic by including different types of people on the list. Let me know what you thought. Also, let me know what you thought about the story-based segment at the beginning. Did you like the storytelling and visuals on screen? Your input means a lot because I want to make videos that you guys enjoy. And the last thing I'll say is, if this is your first Trust Me Bro video, why not subscribe? We make really cool videos and you'll probably like it. Trust me, bro. Serial killers from every state in the United States of America. Alabama. Thomas Whisenhant. Thomas Warren Whisenhant was born and committed his crimes in Alabama. He was born on January 29th, 1947, and was convicted for the murders of 3 women between 1976 and 1977. He abducted, assaulted, and murdered these victims and then mutilated their bodies. Whisenhant was arrested in 1977 after being caught in the act of disposing of a victim's body. He was convicted and then sentenced to death in 1978, and despite multiple attempts to appeal this decision, he was executed via lethal injection on May 27th, 2010. Gruesome start to this video, and it doesn't get much better. Also, it's just wild to me that someone could be on death row for 32 years. Moving on. Alaska. Robert Hansen. Robert Christian Bose Hansen was born on February 15, 1939 in Iowa, but later moved to Anchorage, Alaska, where he lived a life of crime. Hansen was also known as the Butcher Baker for reasons we'll get into, and this individual was seriously twisted. He was an active serial killer in Alaska from 1972 to 1983, a total of 11 years, and unfortunately in that time assaulted and murdered 17 women, or I should say at least 17 murders and assaults. It is alleged that he has up to 37 kills and up to over 31 assaults as well. One of his methods of killing these women would be abducting them and then releasing them into the wilderness, where he would then hunt them for sport using guns and even hunting knives, which obviously plays in the name of the Butcher Baker. And the baker part comes from the fact that he actually owned a successful bakery. Hansen was caught after all of these years when one of his victims who got away led police directly to him. Once caught, he confessed and was sentenced to 461 years in prison without possibility of parole. This monster died in prison on August 21st, 2014. Arizona. Mark Godot. Mark Godot was born on September 6, 1964 in Phoenix, Arizona. Although his time active was only a mere 10 months, the level of terror he was able to bring to the Phoenix metro area was almost unbelievable. Mark Godot, also known as the Baseline Killer, was a serial killer, kidnapper, thief, and assaulter. In this 10-month spree from 2005 to 2006, not only did he commit 9 murders, but has also committed 84 other felony charges. Mark Godot was a seriously bad guy, and in 2006 was sentenced to multiple death sentences, and now he currently awaits execution on death row. According to available data, he was only active as a serial killer and serial assaultist for the 10 months that it claims, although I find it hard to believe that Mark was simply a great dude before this time frame. One reason I believe this is because one of the felonies that he committed, mind you, one of the total 93, is a crime that involves him robbing and assaulting a 12-year-old girl at gunpoint. Scum. Moving on. Arkansas. Ronald Gene Simmons. No, not Gene Simmons, the guy your dad thinks is really cool, the guy that your dad paints his face like, the guy that your dad gets too drunk listening to and hits you. That's Gene Simmons. This is Ronald Gene Simmons. Back on a serious note, Ronald Gene Simmons was a mass murderer who killed 16 people, including 14 family members. Almost as if he was competing with Mark Godot, who committed 9 murders in 10 months, Ronald Gene Simmons committed 16 murders in only 7 days. In Arkansas during December 1987. Ronald G. Simmons was born on July 15, 1940. Simmons served in the military before moving to Arkansas, and on December 22nd to 28th in 1987, he methodically murdered his family members at his home and then later killed 2 other people and injured 4 more in a nearby town. He was arrested without resistance and was convicted of the murder. Simmons was sentenced to death and executed by lethal injection on June 25th, 1990. Gene Simmons from the band Kiss wanted to rock and roll all night and party every day. Ronald Gene Simmons from Arkansas wanted to kill people. California. Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez, also known as the Night Stalker, is likely one of the most infamous names on this list. Strangely, I have never covered him on the channel, even though I've made numerous videos about serial killers. Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960 in El Paso, Texas, but moved to California at the age of 22. Ramirez's crimes were heavily influenced by his troubled childhood, and he even had a cousin who taught him military skills that Ramirez ended up later using during his killing spree. That killing spree and honestly crime spree, which also included assaults and burglaries, took place in the greater Los Angeles area from 1984 to 1985. During this time, he committed numerous heinous crimes such as home invasions, murders, and assaults. His crime spree, marked by extreme violence and satanic rituals, created widespread fear throughout the LA area. And fortunately, he was caught on August 31st, 1985, where he was convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 assaults, and 14 burglaries. He was sentenced to death and remained on death row until he died of cancer on June 7th, 2013. Colorado. Scott Lee Kimball. Scott Lee Kimball was a former FBI informant who was convicted of murdering at least 4 people between 2003 and 2004 while working with the FBI. Kimball was born on September 21st, 1966 in Boulder, Colorado. Kimball was a skilled forager who ran a legitimate business buying and selling organic beef, but primarily used his business as a vessel to enrich himself by passing on bad checks and other forged documents. This is relevant because Kimball would forge documents of his murder victims to make it appear as if they were still alive after they were already dead. Kimball exploited his informant status to evade suspicion and continued his crimes until inconsistencies caught up to him and he was arrested. Not only did he expose flaws in the FBI's informant program, but he was also sentenced to 70 years in prison, where he currently stays today. Oh, and if you're curious who the victims were, it was his uncle, his stepdaughter, and 2 of the girlfriends of inmates. This is almost exactly what I meant when I said that I don't believe someone who was an active serial killer was just a good person before their killing spree. This is a great example of that. Connecticut. Michael Ross. Michael Bruce Ross was born on July 26, 1959 in Connecticut. Ross was also known as the Roadside Strangler and the Eggman, whatever that means. Between 1981 and 1984, he murdered and assaulted 8 young women in New York and Connecticut. According to people that knew him growing up, he exhibited antisocial behavior from a very young age. He was sentenced to death for his crimes in 1987 and was executed via lethal injection in 2005. A fun fact about Michael Ross is that he was the last person to be executed in Connecticut before they abolished capital punishment in 2012. Delaware. Stephen Pennell. Stephen Brian Pennell, also known as the Route 40 Killer, was born on November 22, 1957. Interestingly, Pennell is Delaware's only known serial killer in modern history. Good job, Delaware. But unfortunately, that doesn't make his situation any better. Pennell was convicted of the murder and assault of 2 women and was suspected of 3 others. As the name suggests, he abducted most of his victims on Route 40. Pennell was sentenced to death and executed via lethal injection in 1992, making him the first person executed in Delaware in over 46 years. Florida. Eileen Wuornos. I've actually covered Eileen on the channel before, and her story is really quite interesting. Not only was she a female serial killer, but she was a female sex worker who targeted her male client. From 1989 to 1990, while she was working as a prostitute along the highways of Florida, Eileen killed and robbed 7 of her male clients. When caught, she claimed that she was simply defending herself from assault, but that story didn't quite work. Wuornos was arrested in 1991 and convicted of 6 murders and was executed via lethal injection in 2002. Fun fact about Eileen is that there's actually a movie made about her story called Monster, which released in 2003. Georgia. Wayne Williams. Williams, also known as the Atlanta Monster, the Atlanta Boogeyman, and the Atlanta Child Killer, was born on May 27, 1958. Wayne was only ever convicted of 2 murders, those being the murders of 2 adult men. But what's peculiar is the fact that he is heavily suspected of being responsible for the murder of 24 children. From 1979 to 1981, there was a spree of child murders in Atlanta known as the Atlanta Child Murders. I find it quite interesting that there's enough evidence to heavily suspect Wayne of being responsible for a very specific number of these murders, but not enough evidence to convict him. I guess it's fortunate that he was at least convicted of these 2 adult murders, but I'm sure his story would be much different if he was convicted of at least some of the child murders he was suspected of committing. Hawaii. Randall Saito. Randall Saito is admittedly not a serial killer, but he is still a killer. Saito randomly and brutally killed a woman at Ala Moana Center in 1979, and since then has been spending time in a mental institution as he was acquitted of this murder due to insanity. That's upsetting and scary. What else is scary is the fact that he escaped the mental hospital in 2017. He walked out of the facility, took a taxi to the airport, and flew to California using a fake name. Fortunately, Saito was caught days later and was charged an additional 5 years for the escape, but his escape definitely raised questions about the security lapses at the hospital. Like, I know Hawaii is laid back and chill, but it boggles my mind that in 2017, not 1987, in 2017, he just walked out, took a taxi, and took a flight with a fake name. Wild. Idaho. Paul Ezra Rhodes. Paul is one of your more or less cookie cutter serial killers. He went on a killing spree, killed young women, was convicted of some of the murders, was suspected of more, and was executed via lethal injection. Like everyone on this list, this dude was horrible and disgusting. Illinois. John Wayne Gacy. If you're the type of person to be watching this video, then you're probably the type of person who knows who John Wayne Gacy is. He is one of the most infamous American serial killers and is widely known for his assault, torture, and murder of at least 33 young men and boys. Gacy's story is long and well documented, and I will only be giving a brief overview in this video, but if you're interested, there's a lot of documentaries. Gacy famously lived a double life, as he was seen as a pillar of the community by throwing events for the neighborhood. He was a manager at KFC and then started a construction business after spending some time in jail. Gacy was known as the killer clown because during his community events, he would typically dress up as a clown to entertain his neighbors. Although, unfortunately, for some of his victims, he would also dress up as the clown and assault and murder them. Gacy's story is extremely disturbing and was ultimately caught when bodies were discovered underneath his floor in his basement. Gacy was arrested on December 21st, 1978. He was then sentenced to death in 1980 and executed via, you guessed it, lethal injection in 1994. If a clown ever asks you if you want to try getting out of handcuffs, don't do it. Indiana. Herb Baumeister. Baumeister is a serial killer from Indiana and was active from the 1980s to the 1990s. He is suspected to have murdered at least 11 men and possibly all the way up to over 25 men. Due to the fact that there was no trial, this is all suspected, which is something we'll get into, but it's pretty certain. Why I say that is because human remains were found on Baumeister's property. Not only were the remains of 11 men found on the property, but there was also over 10,000 bone fragments scattered across the grounds of his farm. It is believed that Baumeister would lure victims into his home, specifically gay men, where he would then assault them and then kill them before burying their bodies. Once the police caught on and began looking for Baumeister, he had already escaped to Canada, where he took his own life in a national park before police could ever catch up to him. And for that reason, he was never convicted and never sentenced. But I think he knew what he had coming. Iowa. Earl Nelson. Earl Nelson is one of the oldest entries on this list so far, being born on May 12th, 1897 in California. Earl Nelson was also known as the Gorilla Man or the Dark Strangler. He was a serial killer, a assaultist, and a necrophile, and was also considered to be the first known serial assault murderer in the 20th century. He committed over 22 murders and also 22 separate attacks all across the west coast of the United States, including primarily Iowa. Nelson targeted landladies and their daughters. It would gain entry to their homes by posing as a prospective tenant. He would then strangle the victims and do extremely unspeakable things. Nelson was caught in Canada, of all places, in 1927 and was executed by hanging, not lethal injection. So there you go, something new. Kansas. Dennis Rader. Okay, so this guy is wild. Everybody on this list is a complete lunatic, but this one in particular, I just finished watching a documentary about him. He was known as the BTK killer, which is actually an acronym for his routine, I guess you could say. He would bind, torture, and then kill his victims. And that's how he referred to himself as well. He was active in Wichita, Kansas from 1974 until 1991, a huge gap. What's even crazier is that he wasn't even caught until 2005 when he was arrested and pled guilty to all of the murders. What's potentially even crazier than his time active as a killer, or the large gap after his active period where he was just still free, is the fact that he would also, during his time active, would taunt the media outlets and police by leaving detailed messages describing his crimes. The only reason he was ever even caught is because in 2004, after a 13-year hiatus, he decided it was a good time to start rewriting letters and begin taunting the police again, when at this point, technology was advanced and they weren't playing around, and they caught him shortly after in the following year, and he was arrested, like I mentioned, in 2005. He's currently serving 10 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Kentucky. Donald Harvey. This monster is a little bit different than some of the other monsters on this list. Harvey was a killer who claimed to have 87 murders, but was only confirmed to have 37. Still a ludicrous amount. He was active in Ohio, Kentucky between 1970 and 1987, a 17-year span. He gave himself the name the Angel of Death, and it all makes sense in a sec. Harvey was a healthcare worker and said that he started killing his patients to simply put them out of their misery, but said he eventually grew to enjoy killing his patients. Harvey would typically kill his victims by poisoning them with cyanide or suffocating them with a pillow. How Harvey was caught after doing this for so long, 17 years, is because the last victim he ever killed was a man who was on life support for several months after a motorcycle accident. His autopsy revealed the large amount of cyanide in his system, and then people began to grow suspicious, specifically of Harvey. They became extremely suspicious of him when they learned that he was forced to resign from a previous job in a Cincinnati hospital when he was caught stealing body parts for an occult ritual. Wild that he was even able to continue working in healthcare at all. Harvey lived in prison from 1987 all the way up until 2017 when he was found in his cell severely beaten and then later succumbed to his injuries and died in prison. It's crazy to me that someone working in healthcare with a very strange and peculiar history is able to kill at least 37 people over 17 years and not get caught for so long. We're not even halfway done this video yet, and we've heard some disgusting and deplorable stories. And I'm sorry to inform you, it doesn't get much better. So I did want to take just a quick breather before we got back into it. Okay, if you currently make YouTube videos, I want you to watch this. And if you don't, just skip to this timestamp. I get a ton of questions about how I make my videos, what I use to animate, what I use to illustrate, how I grew on YouTube, and everything of the sort. And my friend, Internet Anarchist, also had a lot of similar questions as well too. Him and I both had very fortunate experiences growing on YouTube, and it wasn't an accident or luck at all. It's my belief that success is caused by three things, not just on YouTube, but in anything: knowledge, experience, and immersion. Knowledge meaning having the right knowledge to know what to do and where to go. Experience meaning actually putting that knowledge into practice, testing it out, and learning for yourself with the proper guidance to avoid major mistakes. And immersion. Immersion meaning being surrounded by like-minded individuals that are on the same path as you, that you can compare notes with and relate to. A big problem that we've noticed in the YouTube community right now is there is a lot of people trying to sell information to brand new YouTubers who don't have a budget and don't even know any better. So they'll fall for every trick in the book, and it's extremely disheartening. Internet Anarchist and I both realized that there was something that we could do, and we did it. That's why for any of my subscribers who have a YouTube channel that are wanting to actually grow and take YouTube seriously, I would love to invite you to our new school community called 1 of 10 Community. This is a completely free community. It's always free and will forever be free. It currently includes myself, Internet Anarchist, other huge YouTubers, and over 1,400 other small creators that are looking to grow their channel and are working every day to get better and providing each other feedback and support. My goal with this group is to provide small and upcoming YouTubers the absolute best opportunity to be able to grow quickly in a way that's not a scam. Like I said, there's a lot of predators on YouTube, and not that kind of predator, that are looking to prey upon small YouTubers who have the dream of growing but don't have the knowledge of making it happen. And unfortunately, these people are typically easily fooled by fake plaques and fake screenshots, and they are sold expensive courses that don't help them. That's why me and Internet Anarchist made something that was better than these paid courses, and it's absolutely free. So before we get back into the killing spree, if you are a YouTuber that follows me and you want to grow more on YouTube, please, I would love you to join 1 of 10 Community. The link's in the description. It's a completely free school community. Make an account and join a network of a ton of YouTubers like yourself who are just trying to grow and make their dreams come true. Okay, back into the void. Louisiana. Derek Todd Lee. Lee was born on November 5th, 1968, and was from St. Francisville in Louisiana. He is also known as the Baton Rouge serial killer and is known for his killing spree from 1998 all the way up to 2003, where during this time, he terrorized Baton Rouge and surrounding areas by committing at least 7 murders of, you guessed it, women. Before his murders, he was a great guy, right? No, not at all. Before his murder charges, Lee was actually arrested for stalking women and watching them in their own home. In an interesting twist, despite this previous arrest, during the search for this serial killer, the police overlooked him because they assumed the serial killer was white. However, Lee was eventually linked to all of these murders of these women in Louisiana via DNA tests, and in 2004, he was put on trial and was sentenced to death. Lee did not end up being killed via lethal injection because he actually died of heart disease in the hospital while on death row at the ripe old age of 47. Maine. James Hicks. Hicks is the only known serial killer from the state of Maine, and information on him was not easy to find. But the long and short of the story is, in 1977, his wife magically disappeared, which caused suspicion, but not that much suspicion because Hicks was not arrested until 1983 and convicted a year later in 1984. Before this arrest, another woman went missing who was last seen at a bar with Hicks. He was never arrested for this disappearance because there was never enough evidence to connect him to it. But after he was suspected of his wife's disappearance 6 years later, they tied the two together. For both of these disappearances, he was only sentenced to 10 years and only served 6 of them and was released from prison in 1990. Once he was released, he met another woman, started a life with her, her, moved in with her, and 6 years later, murdered her. He was suspected in her disappearance, but Hicks was never charged with her death either because of a lack of evidence. This guy was slimy. The only reason that Hicks was caught is because he was in Texas holding a gun to a 67-year-old woman's head, forcing her to sign over the title of her car to him and then write a note you would write to your loved ones telling them you won't be around, if you get my drift. He planned to drug and drown the woman to make it look like she did it, but this woman somehow escaped and Hicks was caught for this act, sentenced to 55 years, and during this time confessed to the 3 other murders he committed and actually led the Maine authorities directly to the sites where he buried these bodies. But yeah, Maine's only serial killer was a disgusting guy who got way too lucky for way too long. Maryland. Joe Matheny. Matheny is a hilarious name, specifically for this dude, because he looks like he enjoys meth-eny. He was born in Baltimore, Maryland, and claimed to have killed 13 people, but was only ever convicted of 2 of these murders. Research later confirmed 3 additional victims through matching his confessions to evidence. So he was convicted of 2, confirmed 5, and claims up to 13. He specifically preyed on homeless men and prostitutes, luring them in with the promise of food and drugs, and actually would just give them death. Notably, Matheny dismembered some of his victims and even disposed of their remains at a meat stand where he worked. He was arrested in 1996, convicted of multiple murders, and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. And in 2017, he was found dead in his cell. So that's him. Massachusetts. Albert DeSalvo. DeSalvo, also known as the Boston Strangler, I think the 3rd or 4th strangler on this list so far, is a serial killer who confessed to the murder of at least 13 women in the Boston area between 1962 and 1964. DeSalvo would gain entry to his victims' homes by posing as a handyman. He, not shockingly, would strangle his victims to death. Very interestingly, DeSalvo was never convicted for any of these murders, but was imprisoned for other crimes. In 1973, in prison, he was actually murdered due to an ongoing debate that had taken place in the prison about his involvement with the Boston Strangler cases. So you could say justice was served, but not in the traditional sense. Michigan. Carl Eugene Watts. Watts was born in 1953 in Texas and might have the highest kill count on this list so far. Not that that's an accomplishment at all. It is just a morbid fact. Watts was nicknamed Coral and was dubbed by media outlets the Sunday Morning Slasher, who murdered an insane amount of women over an 8-year period. He is also suspected of being the most prolific serial killer in all United States history. At the absolute minimum, Watts is responsible for 14 murders, but at the absolute most, he is responsible for over 100 murders. Keep in mind, this was only through an 8-year period. Wild. All of which of these murders took place within Michigan. Watts would stalk his victims, break into their homes, and then kill them using various methods, such as stabbing or strangulation. Watts was arrested in 1982 and was sentenced to life in prison, where he died of cancer in 2007. Minnesota. Paul Michael Stefani. Stefani, also known as the Weepy Voice Killer, was a serial killer who murdered at least 3, you guessed it, women in Minnesota during the early 1980s. He gained his nickname from his tendency to call emergency services after committing his crimes in a sobbing, high-pitched voice. Stefani was caught in 1982 after 2 years of being active and later confessed to the murders. He was sentenced to 40 years of prison and, like some others on this list, died of cancer in prison. Mississippi. Glenn Edward Rogers. Glenn lived a very transient lifestyle and for that reason killed in many different states and lived in many different states. But for the purpose of this video, we're focusing on Mississippi. Glenn is convicted of 2 murders, suspected of 3 more, and claims over 70 total. Glenn was active from 1993 to 1995. And during that time, he worked as a handyman and also, you guessed it, killed women. You can probably guess how as well. Something interesting about this guy though is the fact that he actually was on the FBI top 10 most wanted fugitives list and was caught after a nationwide manhunt. Currently, he's on death row in Florida. Missouri. Robert Burdella. Burdella was a serial killer from Kansas City who was known as the Kansas City Butcher, or more ominously, the Collector. He was active during the 1980s, and during this time, he killed at least 6 young men. Yeah, different. He would lure his victims, who were often young men, into his home where he would subject them to prolonged periods of captivity and torture, typically including assault, and always ended in murder. After being active for 3 years, Burdella was caught in 1988 and sentenced to life in prison without parole. He ended up dying in jail 4 years later in 1992 at the age of 43. Montana. Nathaniel Bar Jonah. This case specifically is quite upsetting and disturbing. Jonah was primarily a child assaulter and was only a suspected serial killer and cannibal. And although he has 0 confirmed murders, he has 5 suspected murders and 10 plus confirmed victims that are children that survived. He was active from 1964 all the way until 1999, which is just heartbreaking. At least in 1999, he was apprehended and convicted with assault, kidnapping, attempted murder, and child assaultation, and was given 130 years in prison at the Montana State Prison, where he died in 2008. Gross. Nebraska. Charles Starkweather. This case has one of the fastest timelines on this list. Starkweather was a serial killer who, along with his girlfriend, killed 11 people in the span of only 2 months. The rampage began with the murder of a gas station attendant, and this snowballed into a series of robberies and killings, including the murder of some of his girlfriend's family members. After this 2-month killing spree, the pair was caught in Wyoming after a high-speed chase. Starkweather was sentenced to death and was executed a year later after being caught in 1959. So let me break it down for you. This guy was 18 years old, decides to go on a 2-month killing spree, and is executed via the electric chair only 6 months after being put on death row. He died at the age of 20. That is quick justice. His girlfriend, on the other hand, who was his accomplice, was only sentenced to 17 years in jail. Wild. Nevada. Carol Cole. This is the first man I've ever seen named Carol, so that's something. Cole was a serial killer who was convicted of strangling 2 women in Nevada and murdering 3 others in Texas. This is pretty typical. What's not as typical is that he is believed to be linked to at least 30 other murders between 1947 and 1980. A huge 33-year gap of being an active potential killer. Wild. Cole was sentenced to death for his crimes, and for his last meal he had jumbo fried shrimp, french fries, and salad with French dressing and Boston clam chowder. And the next day he was executed via lethal injection on December 6th, 1985. New Hampshire. Sheila LaBear. In 2008, Sheila was convicted for murdering 2 of her boyfriends in 2005 and 2006, respectively. And she claims that she did this because she was sent by God as an avenging angel to Earth to punish pedophiles, which in her mind included her 2 boyfriends, whose bodies were found on her huge farm. Now you might be like, all right, I can get behind this a bit, I get it. Here's another twist. According to Brad Bailey, a defense attorney who represented her, he says, and I quote, "There seemed to be no basis whatsoever in reality to suggest or claim any of her victims were pedophiles or engaged in any of these child abusing behaviors. None whatsoever." So yeah, not only did she murder people, but she also tried to ruin their name. Sheila typically met her victims by putting out personal ads looking for farm hands on her farm. Although she was only convicted of the murder of 2 men, she also admitted during her trial that she killed several others, but these were not confirmed. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. New Jersey. Richard Biegenwald. Biegenwald was active from 1958 all the way till 1983. And during this time, you guessed it, he murdered people. In 1983, he was convicted of 5 murders, but was suspected of 8. An interesting fact is, after this serial killer died, his lawyer actually mentioned publicly that this criminal told his lawyer that he may have up to 100 victims, which is likely inflated, but the fact is this monster likely had many more victims than he was convicted for, which doesn't seem extremely uncommon for this list. Richard was actually on death row for a short amount of time, but it was overturned and he was resentenced to life in prison, where he still died in prison in 2008. New Mexico. David Parker Ray. Ray was a suspected torturer who is also known as the Toy Box Killer. This case is really interesting because he technically has 0 murders confirmed, but has 3 confirmed victims and possibly anywhere from 60 to 100 plus victims that he tortured and assaulted on his property in his toy box, which was basically a trailer beside his home, which is a movable, portable torture chamber that he had a large kidnapping and assault operation happening in there. Crazy. For the unthinkable amount of torture that he inflicted upon potentially hundreds of women, Ray was sentenced to 224 years in prison, where he unfortunately only served a few months because he died of a heart attack. Unfortunate he didn't serve more time. Not unfortunate that he died. Ray was a serious monster and is even quoted saying that he did nothing wrong to women. He only did what women wanted, and he got pleasure from their pleasure. And his assault on these women was, in his mind, him doing good for society. So he thought it'd be total sicko. New York. David Berkowitz. David Berkowitz, also known as the Son of Sam or Mr. Monster, according to Wikipedia, was a serial killer who terrorized New York City in the summer of 1976 and 1977. Berkowitz, surprise, surprise, targeted young women and couples, shooting them in cold blood with a .44 caliber revolver. His crimes sparked a citywide manhunt for him, and he even left notes taunting the police, promising more crimes. Fortunately, Berkowitz was caught in 1977 and later confessed to all of his crimes, which were plentiful. He ended up murdering 6 people and wounding 11 more. He is currently in jail serving 6 life sentences as we speak. North Carolina, Henry Louis Wallace. Wallace may have one of the most odd nicknames on this list. He is known as the Charlotte Strangler, which is somewhat tame, but he's also known as the Taco Bell Strangler. This video is not a laughing matter, but that name is weird. I guess it's because he worked as a manager at Taco Bell in Charlotte. Wallace was a serial assaulter and murderer, targeting young African-American women, and over the course of a 4-year span, he victimized over 9 women. He was caught in March of 1994 and currently sits on death row awaiting execution. North Dakota, Eugene Butler. The story of Butler is unlike anything we've heard on this list so far. He is the only killer who was never convicted of his crimes so far on this list. Eugene Butler was born in 1849 in New York State, but all of his crimes took place and he actually died in North Dakota. But we'll get into that. From the years of 1900 to 1906 in Niagara, North Dakota, Butler murdered 6 teenage boys in his house and buried the bodies in his basement. Now, the twist of all this, Butler was actually committed to an insane asylum for unrelated charges where he died in 1913. The crazy part is the bodies that were buried in his house were not found until 1915, 2 years after Butler died in the insane asylum. Super weird. Ohio, Anthony Sewell. The story of Sewell is something we've heard numerous times on this list so far, so I'll keep it brief. He had a generic name. He was known as the Cleveland Strangler. He was active for 2 years, from 2007 till 2009. He murdered at least 11 women who he targeted, specifically women that were vulnerable. By that, I mean women that were either dealing with addiction or homeless. And he was arrested in 2009 when one of his victims escaped and alerted authorities. He was convicted of multiple counts of murder and was sentenced to death in 2011. Sewell died in 2021 due to an unspecified terminal illness. Oklahoma, Roger Dale Stafford. Stafford was a serial killer active from 1974 until 1978, and in this time he had 9 confirmed kills, which he was evicted of, but potentially a lot more. Stafford started his killing spree by killing an assistant manager working at a McDonald's. After killing this manager, he robbed the McDonald's for over $1,300 and then continued on his spree. His next targets were a family that he flagged off the side of the highway, who he robbed and murdered, the entire family. 3 weeks later, he robbed a sirloin stockade in Oklahoma City, and during this robbery, murdered 6 employees, most of these victims being teenage staff members. 6 days after this restaurant massacre, Stafford was found and apprehended. Unsurprisingly, he was sentenced to death, and in 1995, he was executed via lethal injection. Oregon, Dayton Leroy Rogers. Dubbed the Molalla Forest Murderer due to the fact that he would dump the bodies of his victims in the Molalla Forest in Oregon. Rogers was a serial killer who was active for, once again, 4 years and targeted, once again, vulnerable women, specifically addicts, sex workers, and the like. Rogers notably was sentenced to death 4 times, with each sentence being overturned by the Oregon Supreme Court. And in 2021, his death sentence was overturned again due to new laws, and in 2022, his sentence was commuted to life without parole. Pennsylvania, Gary Heidnik. Gary was a serial kidnapper, torturer, and murderer, and fortunately was only active for just over a year. During this year, he kidnapped 6 women, 2 of which died from his torture, and the other 4 fortunately survived. One of these surviving victims was actually able to go to the authorities and inform them about Gary's horrendous actions. Gary was quickly arrested in March 1987 and convicted of multiple charges, including first-degree murder, kidnapping, assault, aggravated assault, and more. He was sentenced to death, and in 1999, he was executed via lethal injection and was one of the last people to ever be executed in the state of Pennsylvania. Rhode Island, Craig Price. I believe Price is the youngest killer we've seen on this list, with his first murders taking place when he was only 13 years old. From the ages of 13 to 15, he committed 4 murders of women in his neighborhood, and he was arrested at the age of 15. Due to his age, he was actually initially set for release at the age of 21, which to me is mind-boggling for someone who murdered 4 people, no matter their age. But due to ongoing violent behavior within prison, he was sentenced to a much longer time and actually tried as an adult. He will likely never see the light of day. South Carolina, Donald Henry Gaskins. Gaskins was born in 1933 and unfortunately had a huge span of crimes in his lifetime, starting in 1953 and going all the way until 1982. During this time, he had 15 confirmed kills and later on claimed he had up to 110. He killed hitchhikers, acquaintances, and more, and had a laundry list of charges under his belt. A couple notable things about Gaskins is the fact that when he was arrested, he was actually sentenced to death, but then was later commuted to only life in prison, but then later killed someone in prison using a bomb, and because of that was once again sentenced to death and later executed in prison in 1991. Dude literally got off death row and got right back on with a bomb somehow. Crazy. South Dakota. Robert Leroy Anderson. Anderson was your run-of-the-mill creep. He was an assaulter and killer. He has at least 2 confirmed victims across multiple states in the US, primarily South Dakota, and would typically lure victims by posing as a photographer wanting to take pictures of people. He was convicted and sentenced to death in 1984, and in 2002 died in prison while waiting for execution. Tennessee. Paul Dennis Reed. Reed was also known as the fast food killer, specifically because he targeted fast food workers working the late shift. He would rob, assault, and murder these employees, and was sentenced to death for the murder of 7 fast food employees in the Nashville metropolitan area. Reed was sentenced to death and died in 2013 while waiting for execution. Fast food employees really deal with too much. Texas. Dean Corll. Corll, also known as the Candyman or the Pied Piper, was a mass serial killer, serial assaulter, and serial torturer, and was a member of the Houston mass murders, which at the time of its discovery were considered the worst example of serial murders in the entire history of the US. Corll was known as the Candyman because his family had previously owned and operated a candy company in Houston, and he personally had been known to give free candy to local children, which is the most stereotypical and scary thing I've ever heard. And he was known as the Pied Piper because his murders would typically start with him luring people, typically with the offer of a ride or for an invite to a party. From the years of 1970 to 1973, Corll and his 2 accomplices murdered at the very least 28 victims. Unfortunately, I can't tell you how much time Corll got because he was never sentenced. He was actually murdered by one of his accomplices before he was ever caught, which may be good or bad news depending on how you look at it. After this accomplice killed Corll, they called the police and promptly confessed to all of the murders, leading to the discovery that shocked Houston to its core. Utah. Ted Bundy. If you're watching this video, you definitely know who Ted Bundy is, and I probably don't need to tell his story. But as a quick recap, he has an unknown amount of victims, but it's likely believed to be in the range of 30 to 36. He was active during the 1970s and was executed in 1989. If you want more details, watch this video. I go in extreme depth about his story. He is a great example of why you should never judge a book by its cover. Vermont. Israel Keyes. Keyes is a very strange serial killer. He was extremely meticulous in his planning, but extremely random in his selection of victims. He murdered at least 11 people across multiple states, including Vermont, between 2001 and 2012. And Keyes even had a specific method of burying what he called kill kits in different locations so he could commit murder at any time. He was captured in 2012 and didn't continue living, I'm not going to say unalive because that's the dumbest thing ever, while awaiting trial, leaving so many questions unanswered about his motives and the true extent of his crimes. Virginia. Timothy Wilson Spencer. Spencer was active from 1994 to 1998, once again, 4 years, committed 5 assaults and murders, and was sentenced to death by electric chair, not lethal injection. Washington. Gary Ridgway. Ridgway was active from 1982 to 1988, confirmed, and was possibly active as recent as 2001. He was arrested on November 30th in 2001 and confessed to murdering at least 71 women, many of whom were vulnerable women, like we explained before. This unfathomable kill count made him one of the most prolific serial killers in US history. In 2001, he pled guilty to 48 counts of murder to avoid the death penalty and is currently serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. It's crazy how someone with 71 murders can actually avoid the death sentence. Whether you're for it or against it, it's crazy how somebody with 2 murders can get the death penalty, but someone with 48 confirmed at the very least can get around it. West Virginia. Harry Powers. Powers was an active killer in the 1930s and was particularly evil because he preyed upon vulnerable, lonely widows who had just lost a loved one. He would meet them on classified ads in the newspaper and would murder them for their money. During his time active, he killed at least 5 women and 3 children before being caught. He was tried, convicted, and executed in 1932. Once his story gained national attention, it was considered to be a contributing factor to people's fear of meeting people through classified ads in the newspaper. Wisconsin. Jeffrey Dahmer. Much like Ted Bundy, this demented monster likely needs no introduction. His story has been told many times, and his infamy is widespread. If you want an in-depth review, here's a video where I discuss his story at length. In short, he murdered and dismembered 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. He primarily targeted black young men, luring them into his home with the promises of sex or money. He did unspeakable things to his victims' bodies and was arrested in 1991 and sentenced to 16 life terms in prison, but was only killed a few years later in 1994 by a fellow inmate. Wyoming. Dale Wayne Eaton. Eaton was a suspect in a string of murders known as the Great Basin Murders, which took place from 1983 to 1997, where over 9 victims, most of them being teenage females, were assaulted and killed. Eaton was sentenced to death, but the sentence was commuted to life in prison. And ladies and gentlemen, there we have it. One serial killer from every single state. There was honestly a surprising amount of similarities across the board. Notably, at least to me, were the fact that a lot of these murderers were able to get away for 4 years. That was a pretty common trend. And every killer has some weird nickname, like the something strangler, which is the most common. It's like being a rapper and having Lil in your name. And a very unfortunate and upsetting trend is that almost every serial killer was also a serial assaultist, except for one guy. One guy, or maybe 2 of these guys, was a robber that murdered people. Not necessarily much better.